Juvie. By Michael. Front matter. This book is dedicated to the countless young men and women whose lives have been touched by the juvenile justice system. Their stories, often untold and unheard, are the heart of this narrative. It is a testament to their resilience, their strength in the face of adversity, and their unwavering hope for a better future, even amidst the bleakest of circumstances. This is not just a work of fiction, it's a reflection of the raw, unforgiving realities they face daily. It is a tribute to their perseverance, their fight for survival, and their often unspoken dreams. This dedication is also for the families and communities grappling with the devastating impact of incarceration. The weight of their burdens, the anguish of separation, and the relentless struggle to provide support are often invisible to the outside world. This book aims to shed light on their experiences, their sacrifices, and their unwavering commitment to their loved ones. Furthermore, this work is dedicated to those who work tirelessly within the system, those who see beyond the labels and the statistics, and those who strive to offer hope and guidance amidst the chaos. They are the unsung heroes, battling against systemic failures and advocating for the very individuals often written off as lost causes. Their dedication and compassion are a powerful testament to the potential for redemption, even within a system often riddled with flaws. Finally, this book is dedicated to the memory of those whose journeys ended prematurely, whose lives were cut short by circumstance or by the system itself. Their stories, though unfinished, serve as a stark reminder of the urgent need for systemic reform and the importance of compassion and understanding. Their loss underscores the immense human cost of a system in desperate need of change. Their silenced voices deserve to be heard, their stories deserve to be told. May this work serve as a small contribution to honoring their memory and to fighting for a future where such losses are prevented. It is to all of them, the survivors, the families, the advocates, and the lost, that this book is humbly dedicated. Chapter 1. Arrival. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the low hum of fluorescent lights, a sterile scent battling the raw, feral smells clinging to the 10 boys herded into the intake room. It was a stark contrast, the clinical cleanliness of the juvenile hall clashing with the grime and desperation etched onto their faces. Each boy represented a shattered piece of a broken system, a testament to a society's failure to catch them before they fell. First came Marco, a whirlwind of defiance. He shoved his hands deep in his pockets, his gaze flitting around the room, a simmering anger barely contained beneath his cocky smirk. His ripped jeans and faded band t-shirt screamed rebellion, a defiant middle finger to the authority figures who now held him captive. He'd been caught spray painting a controversial mural on a condemned building, an act of vandalism, yes, but also a desperate cry for attention in a world that had largely ignored him. The intake officer, a woman with weary eyes and a clipboard clutched tight in her hand, barely registered his simmering rage, her expression as flat and emotionless as the pale green walls. Next was Miguel, his eyes wide and filled with a terror that bordered on paralysis. He was small for his age, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. He'd been caught shoplifting, a desperate attempt to provide for his younger siblings after his mother's sudden illness left them destitute. The fear in his eyes wasn't of punishment, but of the uncertainty that awaited him, the gaping hole left by his absent father and the looming weight of responsibility beyond his years. He clutched a worn teddy bear, a pathetically inadequate shield against the harsh reality that surrounded him. Then came David, a quiet boy, almost invisible. He shuffled in, his gaze downcast, his face pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the bravado of Marco and the stark terror of Miguel. He didn't resist or fight back, his body language suggesting a soul already crushed. His crime, possession of a small amount of marijuana, seemed almost insignificant next to the bleak despair that radiated from him, the weariness of a young life already worn down by an unforgiving world. The details of his home life were whispered between the intake officer and a social worker, a tragic tapestry of neglect and abuse woven into the fabric of his young life. The intake process was a ritualistic stripping away of identity. Fingerprints were taken, mug shots snapped, personal belongings meticulously catalogued and bagged, a process that reduced each boy to a number, a file, a statistic. The sterile environment, devoid of any semblance of comfort or humanity, served as a chilling introduction to the dehumanizing nature of the system. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the fear and anxiety that pulsed through the room, a palpable tension that tightened with each passing moment. The ever-present smell of disinfectant, while intended to sterilize, only served to underscore the cold, clinical reality of their situation. Each boy, stripped of their clothes, belongings, and sense of dignity, was processed with an almost mechanical efficiency, their individuality lost in the churning gears of the juvenile justice machine. The stark cells, each a concrete box barely larger than a coffin, were grim previews of their immediate future. The thin mattresses, stained and worn, offered little comfort, and the chipped paint on the walls bore silent witness to countless nights of restless sleep and quiet despair. There was a grim uniformity to it all, a deliberate design intended to strip them of any sense of hope, to break their spirits before the formal process even began. The echoes of their previous lives, the laughter, the arguments, the love, were swallowed by the vast, echoing emptiness of their new reality. Each cell was a tiny universe, and in each, the boys began the internal battle for survival. Marco, despite his initial defiance, began to feel the weight of the isolation, the cold, hard reality of his situation. The bravado was slowly replaced by a gnawing unease, a chilling premonition of the challenges ahead. Miguel, initially paralyzed by fear, began to exhibit small acts of defiance, a gradual strengthening of his spirit. His grip on his teddy bear tightened, a silent testament to his refusal to be completely broken. David's quiet resignation only intensified, his quiet strength a subtle but powerful counterpoint to his outwardly dejected demeanor. Even at this early stage, the subtle power dynamics began to emerge. Marco's aggressive posturing initially intimidated the others, while Miguel's vulnerability made him a target. David, on the other hand, remained an enigma, an observer in the growing storm of anxieties and uncertainty. They were thrown together, these 10 boys, from vastly different backgrounds, yet united by their shared fate. Their lives, before this moment, were scattered across a vast spectrum of experience. Yet, the sterile white walls of Juvenile Hall stripped them of their individual identities, forging an uncomfortable unity in the bleakness of their new reality. The common area, a sparsely furnished room with a few worn tables and chairs, became the epicenter of their interactions. Every glance, every whispered word, every subtle shift in posture spoke volumes about the unwritten rules that governed this microcosm of societal failure. The fluorescent lights cast long, harsh shadows, highlighting the underlying tensions. The walls, scarred with graffiti, seemed to whisper stories of past rebellions, past failures, past lives lost to the relentless grind of the system. It was here that the seeds of alliances and rivalries would be sown, that the battles for dominance would commence, and that the harsh realities of their shared existence would fully manifest. The initial fear gave way to a growing sense of apprehension. The boys watched each other, feeling each other out, assessing strengths and weaknesses. The thin veneer of civility began to crack. The unspoken threat of violence hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the unpredictable nature of their environment. The first night was a brutal introduction to the realities of their new lives. The constant sounds, the slamming of doors, the muffled cries, the restless shuffling of feet, shattered any attempt at sleep. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, amplifying the fears and insecurities that haunted each boy. Some huddled in their cells, trying to shield themselves from the harshness of their surroundings. Others paced restlessly, their minds racing with thoughts of home, of family, of what might have been. The silence was punctuated by the occasional sob, a testament to the depth of despair that had descended upon them. The first night was a descent into a purgatory of fear, uncertainty, and the chilling realization that they were utterly alone. And this was only the beginning. The intake process, intended to be a mere formality, proved to be just the opening act in a much longer, far more complex drama. The common room, a bleak space illuminated by the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, felt smaller with each passing moment. 10 boys, recently stripped of their identities and belongings, occupied the mismatched chairs and cracked linoleum floor, a silent tension hanging heavier than the stale air. Marco, the self-proclaimed leader, sat perched on the edge of a table, his arms crossed, a predator surveying his prey. His gaze swept across the others, lingering a moment too long on Miguel, whose small frame was almost swallowed by the oversized chair. Miguel, clutching his worn teddy bear, avoided eye contact, his eyes darting nervously between the floor and the other boys. His fear was palpable, a silent scream in the oppressive silence. He was small, easily overlooked, but his vulnerability was a beacon for the predators in this concrete jungle. He huddled deeper into himself, the bear a pathetic shield against the rising tide of animosity. David, the quiet observer, sat apart, almost invisible in the corner. His gaze was distant, unfocused, lost in some internal world of pain. He didn't participate in the silent power play, remaining detached, yet acutely aware of every shift in the room's dynamics. His quietness, however, was not weakness, it was a subtle strength, a silent refusal to be drawn into the escalating tension. A simmering animosity existed between Marco and another boy, a larger, heavier youth named Carlos. Carlos, with his shaved head and numerous tattoos hinting at gang affiliations, exuded an air of menace. Their eyes met across the room, a silent challenge passing between them, a battle for dominance brewing beneath the surface of their forced proximity. Carlos and Marco were clearly from rival gangs, and the detention center, far from neutralizing their rivalry, had only intensified it, forcing them into uncomfortably close quarters. The unspoken threat of violence hung heavy in the air, the shared space was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The other boys, sensing this simmering conflict, watched with a mixture of apprehension and morbid fascination. They were the bystanders, caught in the crossfire of a rivalry that predated their confinement. Each of them was carefully assessing the situation, calculating their own survival strategies, silently choosing their alliances. Some clustered together, forming small groups for support, while others remained isolated, preferring the loneliness to the uncertainty of forging alliances. A low murmur, barely audible above the hum of the lights, began to ripple through the group. It started with whispers, then slowly grew into hushed conversations, each group discussing their personal issues, subtly probing for strengths and weaknesses amongst their peers. They shared bits of their stories, revealing the circumstances that had led them here. They spoke of neglectful parents, abusive guardians, the crushing weight of poverty, and the seductive lure of gangs that offered a twisted sense of belonging. Through the fragmented conversations, a picture began to emerge, exposing the social and economic disparities that fueled their predicament. There were boys from broken families, boys who'd fallen through the cracks of the social services system. There were boys who'd turned to crime as a way to survive, a means to an end in a world that had offered them no other options. In those hushed conversations, alliances began to form. Miguel, despite his fear, found himself gravitating towards David's quiet strength. David's unwavering calm, his silent resistance to the chaos, provided a sense of stability in the otherwise turbulent environment. Their shared vulnerability forged a tentative bond, a quiet understanding between two boys who had been made invisible by the systems that were designed to protect them. A different kind of alliance blossomed between two boys named Javier and Luis, both of whom came from similar impoverished neighborhoods and harbored a shared distrust of the system and the older boys. Their alliance was based on a shared understanding of their backgrounds and a common enemy, the seemingly endless cycle of poverty and neglect that had trapped them both. Their mutual resentment towards the older, more established players created an unspoken pact, a silent agreement to support each other in this harsh new environment. Meanwhile, the growing tension between Marco and Carlos escalated subtly, with barely perceptible shifts in posture and pointed glances, and spoken challenges exchanged across the room. They were playing a dangerous game, a game of dominance and control, where the stakes were far higher than mere bravado. Their rivalry was a simmering volcano threatening to erupt at any moment, threatening to engulf the other boys in its fiery wake. The guards, hardened to the brutal realities of juvenile detention, largely ignored the brewing conflict, their eyes scanning the room with an almost indifferent detachment. They were seasoned veterans, well-versed in the delicate balance of power that governed this harsh environment. They knew intervention at this stage would likely only escalate the situation, so they chose to observe, waiting for the inevitable clash. As the hours bled into one another, the uneasy truce settled into a wary standoff. The boys, having assessed each other's strengths and weaknesses, began to adapt to their new environment, finding ways to navigate the complexities of their shared existence. The alliances they formed would determine their survival, shaping their interactions, influencing the coming days, weeks, and months, and ultimately, their futures. The first impressions were made, the initial alliances formed, and the groundwork for future conflicts and collaborations was laid. The initial stage was over, but this was only the beginning of the battle for survival within the cold, harsh reality of Juvenile Hall. The air remained thick with anticipation, the scent of fear and impending violence a constant reminder of the precarious balance they now existed in. The games had begun. The low hum of the fluorescent lights continued its monotonous drone, a soundtrack to the simmering tensions in the common room. The initial sizing up was complete. Now, a new dynamic was emerging. A boy named Silas, older than most of the others, at least 17, walked in, the newcomer. He moved with a quiet confidence that wasn't bravado, but a practiced ease born of experience. His eyes, a sharp, assessing gray, scanned the room. He didn't need to speak, his presence was a statement in itself. Silas wore clothes that somehow seemed both impeccably clean and utterly worn. The simple white t-shirt and dark jeans were devoid of the graffiti and gang insignia flaunted by Carlos and Marco. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that was both intriguing and unnerving. His silence spoke volumes, radiating an aura of controlled power that unsettled the precarious balance. He moved toward an empty chair near David, not joining any clique, observing each of them with the intense focus of a predator studying its prey. His gaze lingered on Marco, a silent challenge passing between them. Marco, initially bristling at this silent intrusion, found himself strangely subdued by Silas's quiet intensity. This wasn't the brash aggression of Carlos, it was something colder, more calculating. It was the look of someone who had seen and done things that would curdle the blood of even the hardened guards. Silas didn't join in the hushed conversations, but his presence became a focal point. The air shifted, the whispers died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The other boys, sensing a change in the power dynamics, watched him carefully, subtly shifting their postures, adjusting their alliances in anticipation of this new force in their fragile ecosystem. He didn't speak for a long time, simply observing, studying the nuances of their interactions, the subtle shifts in body language that spoke volumes about their fears and ambitions. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to exert his influence. A slight nod here, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture there, and the dynamics subtly shifted. He began subtly offering small acts of mentorship, guidance delivered with a casual air that masked its calculated intent. He helped Miguel, offering a quiet word of reassurance when Marco's gaze lingered too long. He didn't confront Marco directly, instead offering Miguel subtle strategies for self-preservation, advice gleaned from his own harsh experiences within the system and beyond. His interactions with Carlos were equally intriguing. There was an underlying tension, a history unspoken, yet palpable in the space between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared experiences, a mutual understanding of the brutal realities of their lives, but tinged with a simmering rivalry. Carlos, who had previously held a position of intimidation, found himself subtly deferring to Silas's quiet authority. Silas's influence extended beyond subtle gestures. He'd casually mention snippets of information, a guard's blind spot, a weakness in the security system, a whispered rumor about a forthcoming transfer, always carefully chosen to advance his own agenda, while seemingly assisting the others. His past was a mystery, hinted at in the calloused hands, the faint scars on his knuckles, the sharp glint in his eyes. He spoke rarely of it, only offering cryptic glimpses, cryptic statements that revealed just enough to pique their curiosity, yet shielded himself from true vulnerability. He spoke of betrayals, of close calls, of the cold realities of survival on the streets, where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. One day, he shared a story about a knife fight, a near-fatal encounter, his words painting a brutal picture of survival on the streets, where violence was a constant presence, a daily struggle for existence. He spoke of the brutal realities of homelessness, of hunger, of the constant fight for survival, and of the compromises one had to make in order to survive another day. The story was chilling, yet it held a certain grim fascination. He spoke with chilling calm, showing the callousness of the streets and the harsh lessons it imparted. He never explicitly revealed his past crimes, but the implication hung heavy in the air. He was a product of the system, shaped by its brutal realities. He had learned to survive, and his survival was built on a foundation of calculated ruthlessness and, surprisingly, a warped sense of empathy. He wasn't simply a bully, using the others for his own gain. His actions also showed signs of a twisted sense of protection. He was a survivor, and he was teaching them to survive too, though his methods were brutal. Silas's actions were often paradoxical. He'd use Miguel's inherent fear to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Yet, he'd also quietly defend Miguel from more overt harassment by other boys. He'd play Carlos's ego to exploit a weakness, yet would equally ensure Carlos felt a sense of control and respect within his established sphere of dominance within their space. This duality highlighted the complicated interplay between survival and cruelty in this harsh environment. He was a product of the system, not merely its victim. He taught them the harsh language of the streets, how to read the subtle cues of others, how to anticipate danger, how to navigate the treacherous landscape of the juvenile detention center. He was a master manipulator, yet his actions were driven by an understanding of their shared plight, an understanding born out of his own hard-won experiences. He saw himself reflected in them, in their desperation, their vulnerability, their fight for survival. Silas's influence was a complex tapestry woven from threads of ruthlessness and unexpected kindness, manipulation and protectiveness. His presence had shifted the dynamics of the common room, reshaping the alliances, creating a new hierarchy, a more ruthless ecosystem, where the rules were dictated not by the guards, but by the unwritten code of survival in a broken system. The quiet murmur of the fluorescent lights provided a grim backdrop to the lessons of survival being taught within these concrete walls. The game was changing. This was now Silas's game to control. He was a product of the system, and now, he was shaping the other inmates of the facility in his own brutal and unique image. The influence of the veteran, Silas, was reshaping their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. His very presence cast a long shadow over the common room, a shadow born of experience and tempered by the brutal realities of his past, a past he rarely spoke of, but whose influence was unmistakable. The silent tensions of the common room had evolved into something more complex, more dangerous, and more unpredictable, all thanks to Silas. The air in the common room thickened, no longer just the stale recycled air of the detention center, but something heavier, charged with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Silas, ever the observer, noticed the shift. The easy camaraderie, the tense alliances, had fractured, replaced by a pervasive unease. Whispers, once low and conspiratorial, now carried a sharper edge, laced with suspicion. It began subtly, a sideways glance from Miguel, his eyes darting nervously towards Marco, who, in turn, seemed to be avoiding Silas's gaze. Carlos, usually the boisterous center of attention, was unusually quiet, his usual swagger replaced by a brooding intensity. David, usually withdrawn, seemed even more isolated, his silence deeper, more impenetrable than before. The catalyst, it seemed, was a name spoken in hushed tones, a name that sent shivers down their spines. It was a name associated with an incident shrouded in mystery, an incident that threatened to unravel the fragile equilibrium they had established. The name itself wasn't spoken aloud, not in the open, but its presence hung in the air, a phantom limb of the past, a ghost haunting their present. The incident was never explicitly described, but the details were pieced together in fragments, stolen glances, hushed conversations, cryptic comments. It involved a girl, a fight, a betrayal. The details were hazy, intentionally obscured, but the implication was clear. One of them was involved, and the others suspected who. The air of suspicion was tangible, almost suffocating. The subtle shifts in their alliances and power dynamics were evident. Marco, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous twitch, was the main suspect, or rather, his quiet brother was. His brother's actions hadn't directly affected anyone here in the center, but the actions he had taken before his apprehension were significant. The incident, it seemed, had been a turning point, fracturing the previously established order of their shared lives. Silas watched their reactions, observing, assessing. The tension manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. A sudden tightening of shoulders, a hand clenching into a fist, a hesitant breath. The common room, usually a chaotic blend of noise and movement, was now strangely still, each boy isolated within their own thoughts, their own suspicions. Even the guards seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, their patrols more frequent, their eyes sharper. Silas, with his uncanny ability to read the undercurrents of human interaction, began to use the situation to his advantage. He offered seemingly casual advice, seemingly neutral observations that subtly steered the narrative, shifting the focus, controlling the flow of information. He moved like a silent conductor of this new, unsettling symphony of mistrust, weaving a complex web of manipulations that served his own ends. His conversations with Miguel were filled with subtle probes, carefully worded questions that drew out information without explicitly demanding it. He knew that Miguel was particularly susceptible to fear, and he subtly played upon that fear, subtly manipulating Miguel to reveal his secrets, or at least, his part in the overall intrigue. Miguel was scared for himself and his brother. His interactions with Carlos were equally calculated, a delicate dance of manipulation and intimidation. He played on Carlos's inflated ego, feeding his sense of superiority while subtly undermining his authority. He knew that Carlos's insecurity was a hidden weak point, and he subtly exploited that weakness to advance his position and control the situation. With David, he adopted a different approach, a more subtle manipulation, offering a silent sense of companionship, subtle gestures of shared experience without pushing him to reveal his secrets. Silas found a way to influence each of them. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that made the common room feel like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The boys moved with a newfound caution, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, searching for betrayal in the smallest of gestures, the slightest shift in posture. The silence was the most menacing. The moments of stillness were punctuated with sudden bursts of agitated energy. Sleep became a luxury, replaced by restless nights filled with nightmares and paranoia. The uncertainty gnawed at them, feeding the simmering suspicion and increasing the fear. They were trapped within a web of their own making, a web woven from secrets, lies, and the ever-present threat of violence. The guards, oblivious to the depth of the conflict, merely added to the sense of oppression. Their presence, always watchful, always a potential source of punishment, only intensified the atmosphere of paranoia. The daily routines, the monotonous meals, the endless hours of inactivity, amplified the tension, the fear, the suspicion. The routine became a tortuous experience rather than simply a means of dealing with the time. The atmosphere remained heavy with suspicion and fear. Each boy watched the other with a mistrust that intensified with each passing day. Each word spoken was carefully measured, each movement watched with suspicion, each look measured and scrutinized. Silas observed it all, his expression unchanging, his thoughts unreadable. He knew that this was his chance to solidify his position, to solidify his status. The crisis gave him an opportunity to strengthen his control over the other boys and create a new, even more ruthless order. He played the role of a silent observer and a manipulator, pulling the strings from the shadows, shaping the events to his advantage. The days dragged on, the nights were even more intense and turbulent. The unspoken accusations gnawed at their minds, a constant reminder of the danger and uncertainty. The secrets they guarded were like daggers, poised to strike at any moment. The common room had become a battleground, the fight being waged not with fists or weapons, but with whispers, glances, and the suffocating weight of suspicion. The future remained shrouded in an oppressive cloud of secrets, suspicions, and fear. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations, threats, and fears, intensifying the already suffocating pressure within the confines of Juvenile Hall. Each breath felt heavier, each moment more fraught with anxiety. The fragile peace had been shattered, and the consequences would soon reveal themselves. The game was far from over, it was merely reaching a new, more perilous stage. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the cold, concrete floor. The air hung heavy with the smell of disinfectant and despair, a cloying perfume of confinement that clung to everything. Silence, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of a distant bedspring and the muffled sobs from a nearby cell, pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of loneliness. This was it, their first night. Silas, lying on his thin mattress, eyes wide open, stared at the peeling paint on the wall. Sleep was a distant dream, a luxury he couldn't afford. The sounds of the hall, the rhythmic shuffle of guards' boots, the occasional crash of a metal door, the low murmur of hushed conversations, played a relentless symphony of unease in his ears. Each noise was magnified, each silence stretched taut, feeding the growing apprehension that coiled in his stomach. Miguel, across the room, lay curled into a fetal position, his body trembling slightly. His breath hitched in ragged gasps, a testament to the fear that gnawed at him. He hadn't slept properly in days, the pre-trial anxiety and the weight of his brother's actions pressing down on him. He whimpered softly, a sound swallowed by the vastness of the room and the overwhelming weight of his circumstances. Carlos, usually so full of bravado, tried to appear tough, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. But Silas saw the subtle tremor in his hand, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched with each passing minute. The tough exterior was merely a thin veneer, barely concealing the fear that pulsed beneath the surface. He was alone, more alone than he'd ever been before. And the loneliness, sharp and bitter, was a new kind of torment. David, in the far corner of the room, remained silent and still. He offered no outward display of emotion, a statue of withdrawn suffering. His silence was a heavier burden than the noisy turmoil of others. He hadn't spoken much since his arrival, his eyes distant and unfocused. Silas wondered what dark secrets lurked behind that impenetrable wall of silence, what horrors had shaped him into this reclusive shadow. The others, Marco, who seemed lost in a world of his own, oblivious to the tension around him, Javier, who tossed and turned restlessly, muttering in his sleep, and the rest, were caught in their own private hells. Each boy wrestled with his own demons, each grappling with the crushing weight of isolation, fear, and the uncertain future that stretched before them like a dark and endless abyss. Sleeplessness became a shared torment. The darkness of their cells wasn't just a physical absence of light, but a metaphor for the darkness that settled over their spirits, a pervasive feeling of vulnerability that clung to them like a second skin. Every creak, every rustle, every shadow cast by the flickering lights, was a potential threat, a harbinger of violence or further suffering. The night stretched on, each hour a painful eternity. The echoing sounds intensified, the silence deepened, the oppressive atmosphere growing more intense with each passing moment. The boys' attempts at finding comfort or distraction were futile. The shared fear hung heavier than the humid night air. The vulnerability was raw and palpable. It was the vulnerability of youth, the vulnerability of the dispossessed, the vulnerability of being entirely at the mercy of a system that showed little compassion. Each boy was stripped bare, exposed not only to the harsh physical conditions of the juvenile hall but to the raw, unfiltered emotions of isolation, terror, and despair. This was not just physical confinement, it was a stripping away of hope, of self-worth, of future possibilities. As the first sliver of dawn crept through the grimy window, casting a feeble light on the desolate scene, a chilling incident occurred. A scream, sharp and sudden, tore through the silent hall. It came from the cell of a new boy, just arrived that afternoon, a boy smaller than the rest, with eyes that held a mixture of fear and defiance. The other inmates stirred, their sleep broken, their apprehension ratcheting up. A cacophony of shouting and confusion erupted. Guards rushed towards the sound, their heavy boots echoing through the hall. The details of what had transpired remained shrouded in mystery, obscured by the hurried whispers and frantic movements of the staff and the subdued cries of the boy. There were only fragmented stories, snippets of conversation, a whispered accusation of assault, the mention of a stolen item, a cryptic remark about an altercation. But everyone knew that something had changed. The fragile calm of the first few hours had been shattered, replaced by a more profound sense of unease. The fear, now, was less of the unknown and more of the known, the palpable threat of violence lurking in the shadows, hidden within the seemingly innocuous routine. Sleep became even more elusive, the darkness even more menacing, the future even more uncertain. The chilling incident served as a stark reminder that the juvenile hall was not merely a place of confinement, but a place of constant threat, a place where survival demanded both resilience and cunning. The incident served as an ominous foreshadowing of the events that were to unfold, leaving an air of suspense and trepidation hanging in the air. The first night had only just begun. It had set the stage. The fear that had gripped the boys on that first night solidified into a cold, hard reality. The walls of the juvenile hall, once merely a physical barrier, now seemed to press inward, suffocating them with a sense of inescapable despair. The next few hours unfolded with a chilling sense of anticipation. The boys huddled in their cells, eyes wide with fear, ears straining for any sound. They were trapped, not just by the walls of the juvenile hall, but by their own fears, their own vulnerabilities. The fragile hope they had clung to earlier had disintegrated in the cold reality of their situation. The remaining hours until sunrise were a chaotic blend of terror and despair, punctuated by whispers, strained conversations, and the constant anticipation of further violence. Sleep was a distant dream, the night air heavy with anxiety, despair, and the chilling memory of the scream. The uncertainty hung over them, a leaden shroud that stifled any attempt at hope. It was clear that their struggle for survival had only just begun, and the chilling incident of that night would forever cast its shadow over their lives in juvenile hall. The first night had confirmed their worst fears, making the coming days even more terrifying. The oppressive reality of their situation settled in, a chilling foreshadowing of the harsh realities to come. It was a night that would scar them, leaving an indelible mark on their souls. Their journey was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and a future as bleak as the night that had passed. Chapter 2. Hierarchy and Violence. The scream had ripped through the fragile calm of the dawn, a jagged tear in the fabric of their shared fear. It wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration, a brutal announcement of a new order. The unspoken rules, the tentative alliances formed in the hushed darkness of the first night, were shattered. The naive hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a modicum of peace in this concrete purgatory was brutally extinguished. The hierarchy, previously a simmering undercurrent, now surged to the surface, a violent tide sweeping away any pretense of civility. The common area, usually a place of tense quietude, became a battlefield. The previously muted fear intensified, hardening into a palpable tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. It hung heavy in the stale air, thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood, a grim foreshadowing of the violence to come. Marco, usually detached, became strangely agitated, his vacant stare replaced with a nervous twitch. Javier, who had been muttering in his sleep, now watched with wide, unblinking eyes, his usual restless energy replaced by a chilling stillness. Silas, his instincts sharpened by the events of the previous night, observed the shifting dynamics with a grim fascination. He saw the subtle changes in body language, the subtle shifts in alliances. He saw the way Miguel, usually so withdrawn, now stood taller, a newfound confidence radiating from him, a confidence born not of strength, but of sheer desperation. He'd seen Miguel's brother, a figure of terrifying intimidation, before his arrest. He knew the desperation born from a desperate desire to survive. The power vacuum created by the earlier incident was quickly being filled. A boy named Rico, older and considerably larger than the rest, emerged as a dominant figure. He was a veteran of the system, a hardened survivor who moved with an unnerving calm, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence commanded attention, radiating an aura of silent menace. His gaze swept across the room, an unspoken assessment of his new domain. A subtle shift in posture from the other boys, a barely perceptible flinch, confirmed his immediate dominance. The initial skirmishes were subtle, almost imperceptible. A stolen blanket, a whispered insult, a jostle for position in the cramped common area, each act a carefully calculated move in a silent, brutal game of dominance. The air crackled with unspoken threats, with the silent language of intimidation. The guards, their faces impassive, seemed to observe these silent power plays with a detached indifference, their presence a grim reminder of the system's failure to protect the most vulnerable. Then came the escalation. It started with a shove, a sudden, unexpected burst of violence that erupted from the tense silence. Two boys, both vying for position in the nascent hierarchy, clashed in a brutal, short-lived struggle. One was smaller, his name was Leo, his face already etched with the lines of hardship, his eyes reflecting a desperate determination. The other, larger and stronger, was named Danny. Danny had been relatively quiet before, but his sudden explosion of violence was unsettlingly quick and precise. The fight itself was a brutal ballet of desperation and aggression. The sounds of their clash filled the room, the thud of fists against flesh, the grunts of exertion, the sharp intake of breath, a visceral symphony of pain and anger. The air filled with the coppery tang of blood as Danny's fist connected with Leo's nose. Leo crumpled to the ground, a whimper escaping his lips, a sound immediately swallowed by the collective hush that fell over the room as everyone watched. The smell of blood, sharp and metallic, mixed with the ever-present odor of disinfectant and despair, creating a sickeningly sweet perfume of violence. The sight of Leo's blood, spreading across the cold concrete floor, was a chilling reminder of the brutal realities of their situation. The fight wasn't just a physical altercation, it was a statement, a bloody declaration of intent. Rico, watching from a distance, made no move to intervene. His silence was more powerful than any shout, more menacing than any threat. His calm observation confirmed his position at the top of the emerging hierarchy, his authority established not through violence, but through the chilling knowledge that he could unleash it at any moment. It was a masterclass in intimidation, a brutal demonstration of power. The aftermath was silent, except for the occasional pained groan from Leo, who lay huddled on the ground, his face a mask of defeat and humiliation. His eyes, filled with a mixture of pain and resignation, followed Rico's every movement, acknowledging the silent dominance of the new leader. The other boys, witnesses to the brutal display, adjusted their behavior accordingly, their positions in the hierarchy subtly shifting, their fears solidifying into a cold, hard reality. The violence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The constant threat of conflict, the pervasive feeling of insecurity, the ever-present fear of becoming the next victim, it was a weight that pressed down on them, suffocating their spirits, eroding their sense of self. The lack of privacy, the cramped living conditions, further amplified the tension, turning each shared space into a potential site of violence or intimidation. Even during the brief periods of relative quiet, the tension remained, a palpable pressure that threatened to erupt at any moment. Whispered conversations were punctuated by nervous glances, furtive movements, and sudden, sharp intakes of breath. Every shadow seemed to harbor a potential threat, every sound, a possible harbinger of violence. Trust, already a fragile commodity, shattered completely. The boys, once a group of strangers, were rapidly transforming into a collection of individuals bound together by fear, and by the ruthless struggle for survival. The evening brought a new layer of complexity to the dynamics. The limited food rations, the cramped sleeping quarters, and the oppressive atmosphere created a battleground of simmering resentments and barely controlled aggressions. Stolen possessions, whispered insults, and deliberately aggressive movements, all became elements of this relentless, unspoken battle for dominance. The night was punctuated by strained silences and sudden outbursts of aggression. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock the vulnerability of the boys, highlighting their isolation and their fear. The rhythmic squeak of bedsprings, the muffled sounds of movement, the occasional distant shout, all were amplified in the tense atmosphere, creating a symphony of unease that fed their anxiety. Sleep was a distant dream. The night was filled with anticipation, every sound, every shadow, capable of igniting another round of violence. The rigid hierarchy was not only established through physical force, it was also reinforced by psychological manipulation. Rico's dominance wasn't solely about physical strength. It was about the calculated control he wielded, the silent power he exerted over the minds of the other boys. He played them against each other, feeding their fears and insecurities, exploiting their vulnerabilities to maintain his position at the top. The constant threat of violence cast a long shadow, affecting every aspect of their daily lives. Even simple acts like eating or using the bathroom became fraught with tension, every interaction laced with a silent calculation of risk and reward. The shared spaces became a landscape of carefully navigated territories, a minefield of potential confrontations. Days blurred into weeks. The cycle of violence and intimidation continued, reinforcing the established hierarchy, further isolating the weaker members, pushing them deeper into a spiral of fear and despair. The relentless pressure chipped away at their resilience, leaving them hollowed out, their spirits broken. The system, designed to rehabilitate, instead became a breeding ground for violence and brutality, a grim reflection of the society they came from, a society that had failed them all. Their journey within those walls was a grim reminder that survival in this concrete jungle required not only physical strength, but also a chilling adaptation to violence and brutality, a relentless struggle for dominance that would leave its scars long after their release. Rico's reign wasn't merely about fists and brute force, it was a meticulously orchestrated campaign of psychological terror. He understood the intricacies of power not through brawn alone, but through a chilling mastery of manipulation. He'd observed, learned, and adapted, honing his skills in the unforgiving crucible of juvenile hell. His ascent wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, calculated climb fueled by fear and fueled by the system's tacit approval. His first act of dominance wasn't a physical confrontation, but a subtle shift in the distribution of limited resources. The meager supply of snacks, a coveted commodity in their desolate world, became a tool of his control. He'd gift a granola bar to one boy, then subtly deny it to another, fostering resentment and dependence. He'd whisper promises of protection, then withdraw them, leaving them in a state of perpetual uncertainty. He became a puppeteer, pulling the strings of their anxieties, their hopes, their fears. He targeted Javier first. Javier, with his sporadic outbursts of energy and unpredictable mood swings, was an easy target. Rico began by offering Javier small favors, a shared cigarette, an extra blanket, creating a sense of obligation. Then, just as Javier started to trust him, Rico would abruptly withdraw his favor, making Javier feel insignificant and utterly alone. He'd laugh, a cold, cruel sound, as Javier's hope crumbled into dust. Marco, the usually detached observer, became Rico's unwilling confidant. Rico would share scraps of information, snippets of gossip, carefully designed to sow discord among the other boys. He'd casually mention a perceived weakness, a shared secret, turning each boy against one another. Marco, starved for connection, found himself entangled in Rico's web of manipulation, unwittingly becoming an accomplice in his reign of terror. The psychological warfare was relentless. Sleep became a luxury, replaced by a constant state of hypervigilance. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper, a potential betrayal. The boys lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, their nerves frayed, their trust shattered. Even the guards seemed to turn a blind eye, their inaction a tacit endorsement of Rico's brutal authority. Their indifference was a testament to the systemic failure of the institution, a breeding ground for brutality and suffering. Rico's methods weren't limited to psychological games. Physical violence remained a constant threat, a grim reminder of the consequences of defiance. He didn't engage in every fight himself, he used other boys as his proxies, carefully selecting those most vulnerable, those desperate enough for his favor. He'd whisper a command, a subtle suggestion, fueling their insecurities and desires for acceptance, turning them into willing instruments of his violence. One evening, a dispute over a worn-out paperback book escalated into a brutal beating. The victim, a skinny kid named Luis, had been minding his own business, quietly reading, when Danny, one of Rico's enforcers, approached him. The excuse was flimsy, a perceived insult, a misconstrued look, but the result was devastating. Danny, fueled by Rico's silent approval, beat Luis mercilessly, the sounds of the assault muffled by the concrete walls, but loud enough to send a chill down the spines of the other boys. The aftermath was chilling. Luis lay huddled in a corner, his body bruised and bloodied, his spirit crushed. Rico watched from afar, his expression unchanging, his silence a more powerful statement than any words could convey. He didn't need to participate directly. His influence spread like a contagion, a toxic cloud of fear that permeated every corner of the juvenile hall. The hierarchy, solidified by Rico's reign of terror, was more than a social structure. It was a manifestation of systemic violence, a reflection of the institutional failings that allowed such brutality to flourish. The guards, overworked and jaded, seemed incapable of, or unwilling to, intervene. Their presence was more of a grim symbol of the system's failure to protect the vulnerable than a deterrent against violence. This atmosphere of pervasive fear and intimidation extended beyond physical aggression. Rico manipulated the boys' social interactions, their hopes and dreams, feeding off their vulnerability and transforming their shared existence into a never-ending power struggle. He'd spread rumors, creating factions and deepening divisions, constantly shifting alliances to maintain his position. Trust became a dangerous commodity, each interaction fraught with suspicion and deceit. The boys, trapped within the rigid confines of the juvenile hall, became increasingly isolated, their spirits slowly eroded by the constant threat of violence and the pervasive feeling of helplessness. They lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, their days and nights punctuated by the looming shadow of Rico's dominance. One night, a boy named Miguel attempted to challenge Rico's authority. He'd had enough of the constant fear, the relentless psychological torment. He tried to rally the others, whispering about rebellion, about unity. But his attempt was swiftly and brutally crushed. Rico retaliated not with direct violence, but with a calculated campaign of isolation and intimidation, systematically turning the other boys against Miguel, portraying him as a weakling, a traitor. Miguel was left alone, his hopes shattered, his spirit broken. Rico's success wasn't just about physical strength or intimidation, it was about his profound understanding of human psychology, his ability to exploit vulnerabilities, and to manipulate fear and insecurity for his own gain. His actions weren't impulsive, they were strategically calculated, each act meticulously planned to maintain his dominance and solidify his reign of terror. The constant threat of violence and the psychological manipulation created a suffocating atmosphere, impacting every aspect of the boys' lives, turning their shared existence into a harrowing struggle for survival. Even simple activities like eating, sleeping, or using the restroom became fraught with tension, as the boys navigated the complex web of power dynamics, calculating their risks and constantly wary of Rico's wrath. The experience left deep, lasting scars, not just physical wounds but profound psychological trauma, shaping their identities, their perception of the world, and their very sense of self. Their time in juvenile hall, far from being a period of rehabilitation, became a formative experience, indelibly etching the marks of violence, fear, and oppression onto their young lives, a grim testament to a system that had failed them utterly. Their survival, their resilience, and their fight for a better future emerged from the ashes of the brutality they had endured, a haunting reminder that the scars of oppression could run deep, enduring long after they walked free from those walls. The air hung thick with the stench of stale sweat, disinfectant, and despair. Even the meager rays of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows of the juvenile hall seemed to carry the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. Rico's reign, absolute and terrifying, cast a long shadow over every aspect of their existence. Yet, amidst the pervasive fear and intimidation, embers of rebellion flickered, faint but persistent. They were not grand gestures of defiance, not organized uprisings that would challenge Rico's dominance head-on. Instead, these acts of rebellion were subtle, almost imperceptible, whispers of resistance against the crushing weight of their reality. One such act came in the form of a shared glance, a silent communication passing between Miguel and Javier during one of Rico's chilling monologues. Miguel, his spirit still bruised from his failed attempt at a full-scale rebellion, found solace in the unspoken understanding with Javier. Their eyes met across the common room, a fleeting moment of defiance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared suffering, a subtle refusal to be completely broken by Rico's tyranny. It was a small thing, a fragile moment of solidarity, but it represented a refusal to succumb completely to the pervasive fear. Another form of rebellion manifested in the small acts of kindness exchanged between the boys. Luis, despite the brutal beating he had endured, found himself unexpectedly on the receiving end of small gestures of support. Marco, despite his entanglement with Rico, would surreptitiously slip Luis an extra piece of bread during mealtimes, a silent act of defiance against the harshness of their shared reality. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of humanity amidst the pervasive cruelty. These subtle acts of resistance also extended to their interactions with the guards. While the guards, mostly jaded and indifferent, rarely intervened in the boys' conflicts, there were moments of passive resistance. The boys, when questioned about an incident, learned to carefully choose their words, employing a form of calculated ambiguity, slipping through the cracks of the system's oversight. It was a form of silent rebellion, a refusal to provide information that could be used against them or against their friends. Even the routine activities of their daily lives became a battleground for quiet rebellion. The distribution of chores, meticulously controlled by Rico's system of favors and punishment, became a site of subtle resistance. Boys would deliberately slow down their work, adding a silent protest to the already tedious rhythm of their incarceration. It wasn't blatant defiance, but a subtle resistance, a way of reclaiming some measure of control over their daily lives. The written word also became a subtle tool of rebellion. A contraband pen, hidden from the ever-watchful eyes of Rico and the guards, became a conduit for hidden messages and silent protests. The walls of their cells, grimy and worn, became canvases for whispered narratives and coded messages. Lines of poetry, half-formed stories, and silent prayers were etched into the concrete walls, a testament to their enduring spirit. These were not grandiose declarations of resistance, but intimate acts of self-preservation, a subtle rebellion against the relentless erasure of their identities and their personal stories. One night, under the dim light of the moon filtering through the barred window, a group of boys huddled together, whispering a story, a legend of a past rebellion within these very walls. It was a story passed down through generations of incarcerated boys, a tale of defiance against oppressive authority. The storytelling itself was an act of resistance, a refusal to allow their voices to be silenced. It was a sharing of hope, a quiet assertion that even in this desolate place, the flame of resistance could be kept alive. The story fueled a quiet determination, a belief that even in the darkest of times, hope could prevail. It became their anthem, their whispered prayer against the crushing weight of despair. In the suffocating atmosphere of the juvenile hall, these subtle acts of defiance, a shared glance, a hidden act of kindness, a whispered word, were more than just individual acts of resistance. They were symbols of their resilience, their refusal to be totally broken by the system. These small acts built a fragile sense of solidarity, a quiet rebellion against the absolute power of Rico and the indifferent apathy of the system. They demonstrated that even amidst the crushing weight of oppression, the human spirit finds ways to express itself, to resist, and to hope. Sleep, a rare luxury in the tense atmosphere, often became a time for introspection and silent rebellion. Dreams served as an escape, offering a glimpse into a life beyond the concrete walls, a world where hope was not just a fleeting notion but a tangible reality. These dreams, these silent rebellions in the subconscious, were a testament to their enduring spirit, a refusal to let the harshness of their reality completely extinguish the flicker of hope within their hearts. Music, too, became a form of quiet rebellion. A few boys, risking discovery and punishment, managed to create makeshift musical instruments from whatever scraps they could find. The hushed melodies that drifted through the halls of Juvenile Hall were a form of passive resistance, a gentle rebellion against the cacophony of violence and fear. The songs, often improvised, spoke of their hopes, their dreams, and their longing for a life beyond the walls of their confinement. The melody became their unspoken anthem, their quiet defiance echoing in the night. The very act of enduring, of surviving another day within the oppressive walls of the Juvenile Hall, became in itself a powerful act of rebellion. Every day, each boy chose to continue, to fight for a future beyond those walls, even if it was a future they could barely imagine. This quiet perseverance was a testament to their resilience, a silent protest against the injustice and cruelty that had thrust them into this grim world. The boys' strategies for rebellion weren't always passive. There were times when their defiance took more overt forms, albeit still calculated and subtle. They developed their own intricate network of communication, utilizing coded language and gestures to exchange information and strategize. They'd send coded messages, hiding them in plain sight, within the daily routines of their existence. This subtle network of communication was a means of defying the system's attempt to isolate and control them, creating a space for solidarity and mutual support. The smallest gestures of defiance, the slightest show of resistance, held profound significance within the oppressive environment of Juvenile Hall. A shared cigarette, a piece of stolen candy, a secret smile, these minute acts served as quiet acts of rebellion, underlining their refusal to be completely swallowed up by the crushing weight of their surroundings. These were not acts of grand defiance, but instead tiny cracks in the foundation of Rico's dominance, a silent testament to their resilience and refusal to be defined by their circumstances. They were fighting back, not with fists, but with the tenacity of their spirits and the subtle strength of their unity. In their quiet rebellion, they were finding hope and maintaining a sliver of their humanity, a fierce refusal to let the system erase them completely. The acts were small, but their collective impact was powerful, a slow, steady erosion of Rico's power, a quiet but persistent whisper of resistance that promised a change yet to come. The flickering fluorescent lights of the rec room cast long, distorted shadows, exaggerating the already tense atmosphere. Rico, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, barked orders, his voice a grating rasp that echoed off the cold concrete walls. The air crackled with anticipation, a silent acknowledgement of the impending violence. Yet, even in this brutal landscape, a different kind of energy pulsed beneath the surface. It began subtly, a seemingly insignificant act, a shared glance between Miguel and Chewie, two boys who usually avoided each other's paths. Miguel, still nursing the wounds, both physical and emotional, from his failed rebellion against Rico, saw a flicker of understanding in Chewie's dark eyes. It wasn't a spoken word, not a planned act of defiance, but a silent acknowledgement of shared hardship. A brief, fleeting connection forged in the crucible of their shared misery. That shared look, however, sparked something. It ignited a tiny spark of empathy, a subtle shift in the power dynamics of the room. Later that evening, during the chaotic scramble for the meager portions of food, something extraordinary happened. Marco, a loyal member of Rico's inner circle, usually a participant in the daily acts of intimidation, subtly nudged a half-eaten apple towards Luis, who had been targeted by Rico for a particularly brutal beating earlier that day. The apple, bruised and slightly rotten, was a far cry from any act of generosity. Yet, in that desolate environment, this small offering held a profound significance. It was not an act of open rebellion, nor was it born out of remorse. It was, perhaps, a fleeting glimpse of the humanity that lay buried beneath layers of fear and self-preservation. Marco was still bound to Rico's reign of terror, his loyalty was a grim necessity. However, witnessing Luis's pain, even in the context of a constant struggle for survival, elicited an unexpected response. A crack in his facade, a momentary lapse in the calculated brutality he had become accustomed to. These small acts of unexpected kindness extended beyond the boys themselves. One evening, Mr. Evans, a guard known for his stoicism and indifference, caught David sketching in his notebook. The notebook, confiscated earlier that week for unauthorized activities, should have been thrown away. Yet, Mr. Evans simply returned it, silently, as if acknowledging the artistic escape David had sought within the prison's walls. This was not a policy change, nor an act of leniency. It was a silent recognition of a fundamental human need for expression, an acknowledgement that even within the rigid framework of incarceration, the human spirit perseveres. The impact of these small gestures was magnified by the surrounding violence. The cruelty was omnipresent, the constant threat of Rico's unpredictable temper, the casual indifference of some guards, the undercurrent of resentment and distrust between rival groups within the juvenile hall. The harsh reality never disappeared. However, The unexpected acts of kindness illuminated the boys' capacity for empathy, for understanding, for connection. They underscored the human spirit's resilience, its ability to find moments of grace even amidst overwhelming darkness. The small acts of rebellion, described earlier, became intertwined with this unexpected kindness. The shared glances, the hushed conversations, the coded messages, these all created a space where empathy could flourish, where human connection could thrive. They became acts of mutual support, a shared defiance against the dehumanizing conditions of their confinement. These moments of connection were fragile, often fleeting. They existed in the spaces between the violence, in the silences between the screams. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, easily overlooked in the grim reality of Juvenile Hall. Yet, these small acts of kindness spoke volumes about the enduring power of human connection, the surprising resilience of the human spirit. One particular incident stood out. During a particularly brutal fight between two rival gangs, a complete stranger, a boy named Javier, shielded Miguel, who was caught in the crossfire, from a blow that would have likely fractured his skull. Javier himself was severely injured, yet his act of selflessness saved Miguel's life. This spontaneous, unexpected act of kindness transcended the brutal hierarchy of the Juvenile Hall. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated empathy, highlighting the remarkable capacity for human compassion that persists even in the most challenging environments. The aftermath of Javier's act of bravery was profound. It created a space for reflection among the boys, a momentary pause in the cycle of violence. It served as a potent reminder that even in this world governed by fear and brutality, there remained pockets of unexpected kindness, a potential for genuine human connection. The incident also subtly altered the power dynamics. Rico, though still dominant, seemed momentarily unsettled by an act that defied his carefully constructed hierarchy. These moments of kindness, however small, fostered an unlikely sense of solidarity. It created a subtle shift in the dynamics within the group, hinting at the possibility of redemption. These acts created a subtle rebellion against the dehumanizing system of the Juvenile Hall, offering a fragile but persistent hope for a better future. The boys understood, on some level, that despite the system designed to break them, their shared humanity, their capacity for compassion, and their acts of kindness served as a quiet protest, a refusal to be completely consumed by their circumstances. The unexpected kindness was not a grand narrative, not a heroic gesture, nor a systematic shift in the paradigm. It was instead a series of small acts, almost invisible to a casual observer. They were whispers of hope in the midst of a deafening roar of violence and despair. They were gestures of empathy amidst profound suffering, showing that even within the confines of a system designed to crush the spirit, the human capacity for compassion and kindness remains. These small sparks of humanity created a silent rebellion, a profound testament to the human spirit's remarkable resilience. They provided evidence that amidst the bleakness, the potential for transformation and growth still lingered, a subtle but powerful hope for a different future, a future beyond the walls of Juvenile Hall. The unexpected kindness, therefore, wasn't merely a counterpoint to the violence, it was the seed of change, a silent promise of redemption. The air in the rec room hung thick with the smell of sweat, stale chips, and simmering resentment. It had been a week since Javier's act of bravery, a week since the near-fatal blow aimed at Miguel had been deflected. The memory of it, the raw, visceral fear, still clung to Miguel like a second skin. But the aftermath was proving far more unsettling than the incident itself. Rico, his usual swagger diminished, seemed to be operating under a different kind of pressure. His eyes, usually glittering with malice, held a flicker of something else, uncertainty, perhaps, or fear. The fight that had precipitated Javier's intervention had been over a seemingly trivial matter, a worn-out deck of cards. Two rival groups, the Southsiders and the Northsiders, had clashed with a ferocity that belied the stakes. The violence had been brutal, swift, and shockingly efficient. It had ended abruptly, as it always did, with the intervention of the guards, leaving a trail of bruised bodies and simmering resentments in its wake. But the fight, in its chaotic aftermath, had exposed the precariousness of Rico's rule. His authority, once absolute, now seemed to crumble at the edges. The very foundation upon which his dominance rested, fear, was beginning to crack. Javier's selfless act had planted a seed of doubt, a whisper of defiance in the hearts of many. The boys, long accustomed to accepting Rico's tyranny as an immutable fact of life, were starting to question the established order. A low hum of discontent, previously silenced by fear, began to resonate through the cramped confines of the juvenile hall. The shift wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was subtle, insidious, creeping into the daily routines like a persistent cough. The usual rituals of intimidation were less frequent, less forceful. The casual cruelty, the constant threat of violence, was still present, but it felt diluted. The silence was different now, heavy with a sense of foreboding and anticipation. It was the silence before a storm. Luis, the boy who had been the target of Rico's brutal beating, had become an unlikely symbol of this shift. He had been weak, vulnerable, reduced to a mere shadow of his former self. Yet, in the wake of the fight, he was no longer cowering in fear. He held his head higher, his eyes sharper, his gaze more direct. He was still weak, physically, but he was no longer broken. The apple, that small, bruised offering from Marco, became a metaphor for the changing dynamics. It was a gesture that transcended its own insignificance, a symbol of a burgeoning sense of solidarity. Marco himself was a shifting figure, his loyalty to Rico clearly wavering. He still participated in Rico's intimidation tactics, but he did so with a growing reluctance, his eyes often lingering on Luis, Miguel, and others who were previously targets. The internal struggle was evident, a constant battle between fear and a nascent sense of empathy. The claustrophobia of their confinement intensified. The walls, already oppressive, seemed to close in further, reflecting the mounting pressure within the group. Every glance, every whispered word, every shared look carried a weight of significance it hadn't previously possessed. The air was thick with unspoken resentments, hidden alliances, and the ever-present threat of violence. Even the guards seemed to sense the change, their movements more deliberate, their eyes sharper, their presence more forceful. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a confluence of events, a series of carefully layered dominoes falling in sequence. The small acts of unexpected kindness, the quiet acts of defiance, the subtle shifts in power dynamics, the palpable change in atmosphere, all these factors converged to create a point of no return. The old order, built on fear and intimidation, was cracking, crumbling under the weight of its own brutality. A new form of hierarchy was emerging, one based not on fear, but on a nascent sense of solidarity, respect, and mutual support. This new order was fragile, easily shattered, but it was a testament to the resilient human spirit, the inherent capacity for empathy, even in the darkest of environments. The boys, who had been so effectively dehumanized by the system, were rediscovering their shared humanity, rebuilding their sense of self-worth, one small act of kindness, one whispered word of defiance at a time. The consequences of this shift were unpredictable. The violence hadn't disappeared, but it was different. It was less random, less arbitrary. It was directed, strategic, born out of the shifting power dynamics. The alliances were fluid, ever-changing, as the boys navigated the treacherous currents of this new landscape. The fear was still present, but it was tempered by a growing sense of hope, a flicker of rebellion that burned bright against the overwhelming darkness of their confinement. The weeks that followed were a blur of tense encounters, hushed conversations, and uneasy truces. The battle for dominance wasn't over, it had merely shifted its form. The old order had been challenged, but it hadn't been completely dismantled. Rico still held significant power, but his grip was weakening. The cracks in his authority were widening, and the boys, once terrified and submissive, were discovering their strength, their capacity for resistance. One evening, during a seemingly quiet moment in the rec room, Miguel noticed something extraordinary. Rico, sitting alone, brooding, was sketching in a small notebook. It wasn't a violent drawing, not a plan for retaliation or dominance, but a crude yet heartfelt depiction of a sunset. The image, unexpectedly vulnerable, revealed a side of Rico that no one had ever seen before. It was a glimpse into the soul of a young man trapped in a cycle of violence, as much a victim as his fellow inmates. The discovery of Rico's artistic side wasn't an immediate catalyst for change. It didn't suddenly dismantle the hierarchy or eradicate the violence. But it did offer a different perspective, a subtle shift in perception, the realization that even the most hardened individual could possess unexpected depths of emotion, a capacity for creativity and self-expression. This revelation, coupled with the continued acts of quiet defiance, the subtle gestures of empathy, and the shifting alliances, created a powerful current of change, a subtle but undeniable rebellion against the dehumanizing conditions of their incarceration. The turning point wasn't a single, grand event, but a slow, gradual transformation, a metamorphosis fueled by the resilient human spirit, the capacity for compassion, and the unwavering hope for a better future. The future remained uncertain, precarious, filled with potential dangers. The cycle of violence could easily resume, the old order could reassert itself. But the seeds of change had been planted. The boys, once isolated and terrified, were starting to find connection, solace, and a growing sense of their own power. The unexpected kindnesses, the small acts of defiance, the fragile alliances, all pointed towards a different trajectory, a path that hinted at the possibility of redemption, a chance to escape the grim reality of their circumstances and forge a better future, one step at a time, beyond the walls of Juvenile Hall. The turning point was not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning that held both immense danger and the fragile hope of a new dawn. Chapter 3. Betrayal and Consequences. The fragile truce, the nascent sense of solidarity, shattered like cheap glass under the weight of betrayal. It began subtly, a whispered rumor here, a sidelong glance there. Marco, whose wavering loyalty had been a key component of the shift in power, was the first to crack. One evening, during a card game, a seemingly innocuous disagreement escalated into a brutal attack on Luis. Luis, who had just begun to stand a little taller, was knocked to the ground, his newly found courage visibly drained from his face. The swiftness of the attack, the casual brutality, sent a chill through the rec room. Marco's betrayal wasn't a dramatic act of defiance. It was a calculated move, a desperate attempt to regain Rico's favor. The unspoken message was clear. Anyone who dared to step out of line, anyone who showed even the slightest hint of resistance, would face Rico's wrath, amplified by the treachery of former allies. The attack on Luis served as a brutal reminder of the precariousness of their newfound hope. The fear, once diminished, returned with a vengeance, thicker and more suffocating than before. The aftermath was a slow burn, a creeping sense of paranoia that seeped into every aspect of their lives. Whispers replaced open conversations, trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion and distrust. The carefully constructed alliances, built on the foundation of shared vulnerability, crumbled under the pressure. Each boy became an island, surrounded by a sea of suspicion, forced to navigate the treacherous currents of mistrust. Even the air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken resentments and simmering anger. Miguel, who had witnessed the quiet transformation, watched with a growing sense of despair as the old order reasserted itself, though not exactly as it was before. The subtle shifts of the previous weeks were replaced by overt acts of aggression, a calculated campaign of intimidation designed to restore Rico's authority. The meticulously laid groundwork of defiance was being systematically dismantled, each act of violence a brick in the wall being rebuilt around Rico's dominance. Javier, whose bravery had ignited the spark of rebellion, found himself increasingly isolated. His act of defiance, once a beacon of hope, now seemed like a reckless gamble, a foolish act that had exposed him and his allies to Rico's wrath. He tried to maintain his composure, to continue acting as a protector for the weaker boys, but his efforts seemed futile. The weight of the betrayal hung heavy on his shoulders, casting a long shadow over his once bright spirit. The guards, noticing the renewed tension, increased their patrols, their presence a constant reminder of the inherent powerlessness of the boys. The increased surveillance, however, didn't quell the violence, it simply drove it underground, making it more secretive, more unpredictable. The small acts of kindness, the quiet gestures of solidarity, disappeared, replaced by a chilling silence punctuated by the occasional outburst of violence. The change was especially palpable in Rico himself. His brooding demeanor intensified, his eyes cold and calculating. The vulnerability glimpsed in his sunset sketch was gone, replaced by a hardened resolve, a renewed commitment to maintaining his dominance. The artistic side, which had offered a fleeting glimpse of humanity, was buried beneath layers of resentment and anger, a testament to the crushing weight of his environment. The newfound hope that had begun to emerge seemed to vanish completely. The impact wasn't limited to the physical violence. The psychological toll was immense. The boys, already burdened by the trauma of their pasts, were further traumatized by the betrayal and the ensuing paranoia. Sleepless nights, plagued by nightmares and anxieties, became commonplace. A pervasive sense of dread hung over the juvenile hall, a tangible manifestation of their shattered trust and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Their sense of shared vulnerability, once a source of strength, had mutated into a source of fear and mistrust. The shift in the power dynamics extended beyond the rec room. The meals became tense affairs, punctuated by stolen glances and muttered insults. The showers, already a source of anxiety and vulnerability, became a potential breeding ground for violence. Even the quiet moments of reflection, previously a source of solace, were now laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. Every interaction, every gesture, every shared space became a potential battlefield, a reminder of the pervasive lack of safety and security. The weeks that followed were a blur of tense encounters, hushed conversations, and uneasy truces that shattered instantly. The atmosphere in the juvenile hall was stifling, thick with suspicion and fear, punctuated by sporadic bursts of uncontrolled violence. The old order was not simply restored, it was reinforced, strengthened by the betrayal and the subsequent chaos. The brief glimpse of hope had been extinguished, replaced by a darker, more oppressive reality. One evening, during a particularly tense moment in the rec room, Miguel found Marco sitting alone, nursing a fresh wound. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of a nearby basketball bouncing off the walls. The fight that had caused the injury was swift, quiet and brutal. There was a palpable sense of shame in Marco's slumped posture, the kind of shame that came from the realization of irreversible mistakes. He spoke in a low voice of a failed attempt to regain Rico's trust, a desperate gamble that had cost him more than he had anticipated. This incident, though seemingly minor in the grand scheme of the juvenile hall's daily brutality, marked a significant turning point. The betrayal, the escalating violence, the shattered alliances, all pointed to a bleak future. The naive hope for a better future, a glimmer that had once briefly illuminated the darkness, was being steadily snuffed out by a return to the familiar, brutal reality of their confinement. There was no grand battle for dominance. The victory had been quietly claimed by Rico and the old order. His dominance, though fragile and built on the broken trust of the other boys, was nonetheless secure. The absence of hope was not merely a feeling, it was a tangible force, an invisible presence that hung over the juvenile hall, heavy and oppressive. The resilience that had begun to bloom in some of the boys withered, leaving behind a residue of despair and disillusionment. The whispers of rebellion were silenced, replaced by the ominous sound of fear that was once their constant companion. The walls seemed to close in further, amplifying the sense of confinement and despair. The boys, once again trapped in a cycle of violence and intimidation, watched as the old order, now strengthened by betrayal and fear, tightened its grip. The future, once holding the fragile hope of a new dawn, was now shrouded in darkness. The brief interlude of solidarity, of empathy, had ended, leaving behind only the harsh reality of their situation, a bleak reminder of their powerlessness and the pervasive nature of the cycle of violence that bound them. The consequences of this betrayal extended far beyond the physical wounds and emotional scars, reaching deep into the very essence of their lives, leaving behind a wasteland of broken trust and shattered hopes. The journey towards redemption, once seemingly possible, now seemed further away than ever before. The aftermath of Marcos' betrayal wasn't a single, cataclysmic event, but a slow, insidious creep of fear and recrimination. Luis, bruised and humiliated, retreated into himself, the fire in his eyes dulled to embers. He no longer sought out the card games, preferring the relative safety of his bunk, his silence a stark contrast to his previous boisterous spirit. His quiet withdrawal, however, didn't mean acceptance. It was a calculated strategy, a careful observation of the new landscape. He was biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim his dignity, though he knew it would be a long and arduous journey. Javier, initially devastated by the fracturing of their alliance, began to regroup. His initial outburst of bravery, while admirable, had been impulsive, a reaction born of desperation rather than a well-calculated strategy. He understood now the delicate balance of power within the juvenile hall, the necessity of carefully chosen alliances, and the devastating consequences of impulsive actions. He learned from his mistakes, his anger replaced by a colder, more calculating pragmatism. He started observing, gathering information, carefully assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each boy, a silent reconnaissance mission to chart the new power dynamics. Miguel, a keen observer with a sharp intellect, played a critical role in this reshuffling of alliances. He saw the vulnerability in those who had previously been allied with Rico, the subtle cracks in their loyalty. He recognized that their fear of Rico, while real, wasn't absolute. He began whispering, planting seeds of discontent, subtly suggesting that Rico's reign was not unbreakable. His approach wasn't overtly rebellious. It was subtle, insidious, weaving a web of discontent that slowly began to unravel Rico's dominance. The new alliances that formed weren't based on shared ideologies or strong bonds of friendship. They were pragmatic partnerships forged in the crucible of survival. Luis, Javier, and Miguel found themselves drawn together, not by a shared past, but by a shared objective, survival. They understood that their individual strength was insufficient against Rico's might. Their only chance lay in combining their resources and talents. Luis, despite his injuries, provided the experience and caution, the pragmatic approach learned from his earlier mistakes. Javier brought the courage, the willingness to take risks when necessary, balanced by the wisdom of his prior experience. Miguel, the intellectual, provided strategy and insight, maneuvering through the labyrinthine dynamics of the juvenile hall with shrewdness and precision. Their alliance was a delicate tapestry, woven with threads of shared mistrust of Rico, the desire for stability, and the pragmatic understanding that their mutual survival depended on their collaboration. It was not a brotherhood, but a calculated partnership based on mutual self-preservation. Their interactions remained cautious, their words measured, their movements deliberate, each action carefully weighed against potential consequences. Their conversations were held in hushed whispers, their plans hatched in the shadows, always conscious of the ever-present watchful eyes of the guards and Rico himself. The emergence of this new alliance sent ripples throughout the juvenile hall. Other boys, weary of Rico's tyranny, cautiously began to approach Miguel, Javier, and Luis, seeking protection or seeking to gain an advantage by aligning themselves with the emerging power structure. These new alliances were not easily formed, however. Each approach involved a careful assessment of loyalty and trustworthiness, a lengthy and often fraught process filled with covert meetings and whispered assurances. Each potential ally was meticulously vetted, their past actions analyzed, their potential value carefully weighed against the risks involved. Betrayal was a constant threat, and trust a precious commodity, dispensed sparingly and only after rigorous examination. The shift in power dynamics didn't occur overnight. It was a slow, gradual process, a constant dance of maneuvering and readjustment. Rico, initially unaware of the subtle shift in alliances, continued to assert his dominance through acts of intimidation and violence, unaware of the erosion of his power base. His actions, however, served only to solidify the resolve of those who opposed him. Every act of aggression, every attempt to consolidate power, fueled the resentment and strengthened their resolve to challenge him. The new alliances were tested frequently. There were moments of doubt, whispers of betrayal, and near fractures in the fragile partnership. They overcame these challenges by relying on their mutual understanding of the necessity for their collaboration. The memory of Marcos' betrayal was a potent reminder of the fragility of their alliances and the devastating consequences of individual ambition. They had learned from the mistakes of others and understood the critical importance of loyalty and trust. The tension in the juvenile hall reached a fever pitch. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken threats, wary glances, and the constant hum of suspicion. The fragile peace, punctuated by sporadic bursts of violence, masked a simmering war, a constant struggle for dominance between Rico and the emerging alliance of Luis, Javier, and Miguel. This newfound alliance wasn't about reclaiming control of the juvenile hall or staging a dramatic revolt. It was about creating a safer, more predictable environment for themselves, a small island of stability in a sea of chaos. It was about finding a way to survive. They weren't fighting for power, they were fighting for survival, a fundamental shift in perspective from the earlier, more naive attempts at rebellion. This new understanding, this pragmatic approach, was their only hope for survival. The future remained uncertain, yet the newly formed alliance provided a glimmer of hope, a sense of security in an environment characterized by violence and instability. The journey towards redemption remained long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, it seemed a little less insurmountable. The path ahead was still paved with obstacles, but they had found strength in their newfound alliances, providing them with a better chance to navigate the treacherous currents of their confinement and the potential for a better future. The fight was far from over, but for now, they had a fighting chance. The silence in Luis's bunk was deafening. It wasn't the comfortable silence of quiet contemplation, it was the oppressive silence of a man drowning in the murky waters of his own guilt. Marcos' betrayal hadn't just been a physical blow, it had shattered the fragile trust Luis had painstakingly built, leaving behind a gaping wound that refused to heal. He replayed the events in his mind, a broken record stuck on repeat, each rotation bringing fresh waves of self-recrimination. He should have seen it coming, he berated himself. He should have been more wary, more perceptive. His arrogance, his misplaced confidence in Marco, had left him vulnerable, exposed. The pain wasn't just physical, it was the gnawing ache of knowing he'd been played, outmaneuvered by someone he considered a friend. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of regret. He watched Javier and Miguel, their newly forged alliance a stark contrast to his isolation. He saw the quiet strength in Javier's movements, the calculated precision in Miguel's strategies, and a pang of envy twisted in his gut. They were moving forward, adapting, while he remained trapped in the past, paralyzed by guilt. He knew he needed to join them, to contribute his experience and skills, but the fear of repeating his past mistakes held him back. The memory of Marcos' betrayal served as a constant reminder of his own vulnerability, his own fallibility. He feared another betrayal, another fall from grace. This fear, however, wasn't solely based on the potential for future betrayal. It was fueled by a deeper, more profound fear, the fear of revealing his own vulnerabilities, the fear of admitting his own mistakes. He had built his reputation on strength and resilience, and admitting weakness felt like a catastrophic unraveling. Javier, despite his outward pragmatism, carried his own burden of guilt. The impulsive bravery that had led him to confront Rico had been a reckless act, fueled by rage and a misplaced sense of loyalty. He'd risked everything for a friendship that had ultimately crumbled. Now, the pragmatic approach was more prominent in him. He regretted his impulsive actions, understanding that true strength lay not in impulsive heroism, but in calculated strategy and measured responses. He had almost thrown away everything in a desperate attempt to protect a friend, only to see his loyalty betrayed. The memory of his outburst played on an endless loop in his mind, a stark reminder of his youthful naivete and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotion. He was working hard to learn the harsh lessons of the juvenile hall. Every calculated move was to atone for the mistake that could have cost him everything. Miguel, despite his intelligence and calculating nature, wasn't immune to the corrosive effects of guilt. His role in the unraveling of Rico's power was a calculated one, a strategic maneuver born out of necessity. Yet, the subtle manipulation, the whispers of discontent that he'd sown, gnawed at his conscience. He wasn't a violent person, but his actions had set in motion a chain of events that could lead to further conflict and violence, a consequence he had to grapple with. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He'd learned to keep his emotions buried beneath a veneer of composure, but the guilt remained. He justified his actions by viewing them as necessary steps toward survival, but still, he wrestled with the weight of his actions. Every quiet act of manipulation, of strategic maneuvering had an inner turmoil that only he could understand. The shared guilt bound the three together, an invisible thread weaving through their newly formed alliance. It wasn't a bond of camaraderie or friendship, it was a bond forged in the crucible of shared remorse and the mutual understanding of their mistakes. They were united not by their past triumphs, but by the weight of their shared failures. Their conversations were filled with unspoken regrets, the air thick with the unspoken acknowledgement of their individual failures. The weight of their guilt was palpable. Every glance, every subtle shift in their postures, communicated the shared burden that they carried. The guilt wasn't confined to the three boys. A pervasive atmosphere of remorse hung over the juvenile hall. Other boys, who had been complicit in Rico's reign of terror, now felt the sting of their own actions. Some were openly repentant, others retreated into themselves, their guilt etched upon their faces. Their faces showed a subtle mix of guilt and worry. They watched cautiously and quietly. They were afraid, but they had seen the change of power and decided to wait. Some were actively seeking redemption, while others were consumed by fear, paranoia, and the crushing weight of their past actions. Their quiet desperation was evident in their downcast eyes and the subtle tremors in their hands. The entire atmosphere was clouded with a sense of foreboding. The guards, hardened by years of witnessing the cycle of violence and despair, seemed almost oblivious to the palpable sense of remorse that permeated the air. They were used to the routine. The routine of violence, betrayals and friendships was well known to them. Their gaze never left the boys, and their presence alone was a subtle reminder of the consequences that followed. Their stoic silence acted as a constant reminder of the consequences of the boys' actions. The rigid structure of the facility was a silent witness to the constant struggles and turmoil that characterized the lives of the boys. The weight of their guilt wasn't solely an individual burden, it was a collective weight, a shared shadow that hung over the entire juvenile hall. Even Rico, in his solitary confinement, wasn't exempt from the insidious creep of guilt. The reign of terror he'd exerted over his peers was a source of power, but it also fueled a growing sense of isolation. The fear and the paranoia he'd instilled in his peers had isolated him, leaving him alone with the consequences of his actions. The silence of his cell, devoid of the usual cacophony of intimidation and control, allowed the whispers of guilt to grow louder, to become almost deafening. The memories of his violence and his dominance haunted him. He felt a sense of isolation as the new power dynamics played out in front of him. His silence, once a symbol of power, was now a reflection of his despair. The weight of guilt was a constant, unrelenting presence. It permeated every interaction, every whispered conversation, every furtive glance. It was a shadow that clung to them, shaping their actions and defining their future. It was a burden they would have to carry, a heavy price to pay for their mistakes. The journey toward redemption wouldn't be easy, it would be a long, arduous process of confronting their past and grappling with the consequences of their choices. The scars of their guilt would remain, but perhaps, with time, those scars would slowly begin to fade, replaced by the faint glimmer of hope for a better future. The path to redemption would not be without its trials, but it would be a process of self-reflection, of understanding, and finally, of acceptance. This journey would require both courage and resilience, qualities that would be tested countless times as the young men navigated the turbulent waters of their past mistakes and the uncertainties of their futures. But the promise of a better future, however faint, offered a flicker of light in the oppressive darkness. The path ahead would require courage, persistence and the will to move forward. It was a journey that required a deep understanding of themselves and the consequences of their actions. The path ahead was long and arduous, but the hope for a better future was a guiding light in the darkness. The flickering fluorescent lights of the juvenile hall seemed to mock Javier's attempts at composure. The calculated strategies, the careful maneuvering he'd employed to rise from the ashes of Rico's downfall, felt brittle, insignificant against the crushing weight of his own despair. The hollow victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He hadn't anticipated this, the gnawing emptiness that followed the toppling of a tyrant. He'd expected relief, a sense of accomplishment, but instead, he found himself sinking deeper into the mire of his own troubled past. The nights were the worst. The silence, broken only by the distant groans of other boys or the rhythmic clang of a distant metal door, amplified the turmoil within. He found himself staring at the peeling paint on the wall, tracing the cracks with his finger, lost in a labyrinth of memories. The face of his younger sister, her eyes wide with fear as Rico threatened their family, haunted him. The betrayal of his friend, the reckless impulsive act that almost cost him everything, played on a loop in his mind, a constant reminder of his failures. He started small, a stolen cigarette here, a shared joint there. Initially, it was a way to dull the sharp edges of his guilt, to numb the constant ache in his chest. But soon, the cigarettes weren't enough. The fleeting relief they offered was quickly replaced by a deeper, more insidious emptiness. The nicotine became a crutch, a false promise of solace in a world devoid of comfort and hope. The joint sessions escalated to something more, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating reality of his circumstances. He found himself drawn to the darker corners of the juvenile hall, where the air hung heavy with the smell of weed and desperation, where other lost boys sought solace in the oblivion offered by drugs. Miguel, ever the pragmatist, watched Javier's descent with a mixture of concern and detached observation. He understood the allure of escape, the siren song of oblivion that whispered promises of solace in the face of unbearable pain. He, too, carried the weight of his actions, the subtle manipulations, the carefully orchestrated whispers that had brought down Rico. He knew the guilt was a poison, slowly consuming him from within. He understood Javier's desperate need to escape the weight of his past, and he too, fell into the same trap. His methods were different. He didn't seek the hazy oblivion of drugs. Instead, he found solace in the calculated precision of violence. It wasn't random, uncontrolled rage, it was a controlled release, a meticulously planned act of self-destruction. He found a perverse satisfaction in the calculated power he could exert. The act of hurting himself seemed less about pain, and more about control. A way to reclaim a semblance of power in his life. His targets were carefully chosen, the weakest among them, the boys who were easily intimidated, the ones who wouldn't fight back. The violence wasn't about conquest or dominance, it was a twisted form of self-flagellation, a desperate attempt to inflict pain on himself through proxy. Each act of violence brought a fleeting sense of control, a momentary illusion of power in a world where he felt utterly powerless. He knew it was self-destructive, that the cycle of violence would only lead to further despair. But he was losing sight of everything else. Luis, still grappling with Marcos' betrayal, watched both Javier and Miguel's descent into darkness with a chilling sense of foreboding. He'd seen this before, witnessed the slow, agonizing unraveling of boys who had been stripped of hope. He had hoped that their shared burden of guilt would unite them, that they could find strength in their shared experience. But the weight of their guilt had driven them further into the shadows. Instead, it pushed them towards different forms of self-destruction. The walls of the juvenile hall seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with the stench of despair and hopelessness. He saw the desperation reflected in the eyes of the other boys, a silent testament to the systemic failures that had led them to this place. He felt the pressure build within him, the constant need to escape. The despair was pervasive and all-encompassing. He tried to reach out, to offer a lifeline, but his words were met with blank stares, with the hollow echoes of their shared despair. He attempted to break through the cycle of violence that threatened to consume them, offering a measure of solace and understanding. But they were unwilling to listen. Their path of self-destruction seemed predetermined. The nights grew longer, the shadows deeper, and the atmosphere heavier. The shared guilt that had once bound them together now felt like a suffocating blanket, trapping them in a cycle of self-destruction. The juvenile hall, a place meant for rehabilitation, had become a breeding ground for despair, where boys lost in the labyrinth of their past mistakes spiraled further into darkness. The once hopeful glimmer of a better future now seemed a distant star, shrouded in the suffocating darkness of their own making. The staff, hardened by years of witnessing such cycles of despair, seemed almost oblivious to the subtle signs of the boys' escalating desperation. Their routines remained the same. The cycle of violence, betrayal and friendships were a usual sight for them. Their eyes remained focused on the boys. Their attention and presence alone were a subtle reminder of the consequences of the boy's actions. They were accustomed to the boy's behavior, a well-known routine. The escalating violence became a disturbing symphony of despair. The sounds of fists against flesh, the muffled cries of pain, the hushed whispers of fear, all blended into a harrowing soundtrack to their descent into darkness. The walls of the juvenile hall, once a symbol of confinement, became a witness to the slow, agonizing unraveling of these young men. The sense of hopelessness was palpable, a suffocating blanket that shrouded the juvenile hall in a perpetual twilight of despair. Each day brought another layer of darkness, another act of self-destruction, another step closer to the abyss. The cycle of violence had become a self-perpetuating machine, churning out broken boys destined for a future as bleak as their present. The weight of their experiences, their guilt, and their despair pressed down on them, an oppressive force that threatened to crush them completely. The future seemed devoid of hope. The boys were lost in a labyrinth of pain, self-destruction, and despair, with no guiding light to lead them out. The juvenile hall, a place intended for rehabilitation, had become a crucible of despair, where young lives were consumed by the shadows of their past mistakes and the crushing weight of their present circumstances. The relentless cycle of violence and self-destruction continued, a tragic testament to the systemic failures that allowed these young men to slip through the cracks of society and into the abyss of despair. The relentless cycle perpetuated itself, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. The absence of support and guidance only amplified their desperation, pushing them further towards the darkness. The stale air hung heavy with the scent of despair, a suffocating blanket draped over the juvenile hall. Luis, watching Miguel meticulously carve another jagged line into his already scarred arm, felt a familiar pang of helplessness. The controlled rage, the precise self-inflicted wounds, were a chilling testament to the depth of Miguel's pain. It was a slow, agonizing self-destruction, a meticulously crafted masterpiece of despair. He tried to intervene, to offer a hand, but his words had been met with the hollow echo of Miguel's own self-loathing. He understood the boys' need for control, the desperate craving for power in a world where they were stripped of it. But Luis also knew that this path led only to ruin. Javier, meanwhile, had found a different kind of oblivion. The cigarettes and joints had escalated to something far more dangerous, something that gnawed at his insides, twisting his insides with agonizing pain. He spent his days in a haze, his eyes glazed over, his movements slow and slurred. The sharp edges of his guilt were dulled, but so too was his will to fight, to resist the pull of the abyss. The fleeting relief offered by his addiction felt less like an escape and more like a slow descent into a numb existence. It was a constant cycle of highs and lows. Then, one afternoon, a new counselor arrived. Her name was Ms. Evans, and she was different from the hardened staff who had become accustomed to the boys' cycles of violence and despair. Her eyes, though weary, held a spark of genuine concern, a flicker of empathy that cut through the layers of cynicism that had settled over the juvenile hall. She didn't shy away from the boys' pain, instead, she met their gazes with unwavering understanding. She didn't lecture or judge, she listened. She started small, engaging the boys in quiet conversations, offering a listening ear and a warm smile that felt foreign in this cold, desolate place. She wasn't quick to judge them, but instead sought to understand them. She spoke to them about their struggles, their families, and their hopes and dreams for the future. It was as though she saw beyond the layers of hardened facades, beyond the acts of violence and self-destruction, to the fragile souls trapped within. She spent hours talking to Javier, gently probing, patiently encouraging him to share his burdens. She never pressed too hard, never forced him to confront his past before he was ready. Instead, she offered him space, a safe space for him to begin the journey towards healing. Slowly, tentatively, Javier began to open up. He spoke of his sister, the fear in her eyes, the crushing weight of responsibility he'd carried since their parents' demise. He admitted his feelings of guilt, his regret for betraying his trust. He confessed his anxieties regarding his future. He confessed how he felt trapped in an endless cycle of despair. Ms. Evans listened, her presence a silent testament to the power of compassion. He didn't always know what to say, but she offered the needed patience and calmness. He found himself speaking to her about things he'd never shared with anyone before. The sharing alone was a form of release, a step towards healing. She began to help him recognize the signs of his addiction and offered him guidance and support in making decisions that were right for him. With Miguel, the approach was different. Ms. Evans didn't try to force him to stop hurting himself. She didn't attempt to diminish his actions. She simply observed, patiently waiting for him to acknowledge the depth of his pain. She started by engaging him in quiet conversations, subtly steering the conversations towards his talents, his skills. She subtly offered him tools and resources to harness his anger and channel it into something productive. He had a natural knack for art, and she arranged for him to have access to art supplies. She also arranged for him to have a mentor. At first, Miguel was resistant, his guarded nature a shield against any attempts at connection. He didn't trust her. He didn't trust anyone. But Ms. Evans's persistence was relentless, her patience unwavering. She didn't push him, didn't demand anything of him. She simply offered her presence, her unwavering support, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She also offered support through an experienced mentor, who knew a thing or two about handling anger and working through it. Slowly, through his art, Miguel began to express his pain, his rage, his self-loathing. His artwork became a reflection of the turmoil inside, a visual representation of his struggles. The drawings were dark, violent, raw, but within the darkness, there were glimmers of light, hints of hope, subtle suggestions of healing. The mentor further encouraged his artistic endeavors by helping him find his voice and express his emotions. Miguel felt a sense of accomplishment, the ability to express his pain in a way that was healthy and constructive. The paintings allowed him to reclaim a sense of control, to harness the destructive force of his anger and channel it into something creative. He began to participate in art therapy, a process that further aided in his emotional healing and self-expression. Luis, witnessing the subtle changes in Javier and Miguel, felt a surge of hope. He saw a possibility, a glimmer of light that pierced the darkness that had enveloped the juvenile hall for so long. He joined Ms. Evans's art therapy group. He also engaged with a community group outside of Juvie Hall, which provided him with the social support he needed. Ms. Evans provided him with the opportunity to heal and engage with a community outside the walls of Juvie Hall. The group aided him in finding constructive ways to deal with his pain, offering him emotional support and understanding. He learned that he wasn't alone in his struggles, that others shared his pain, and that healing was possible. The transformation wasn't immediate, it wasn't easy. There were setbacks, relapses, moments of despair that threatened to pull them back into the darkness. But the presence of Ms. Evans, her quiet empathy, her unwavering belief in their potential, provided a constant source of strength and support. Her presence helped him see a glimmer of hope, of the possibility of a better future. She instilled a belief in him that he, too, could heal, could change, could overcome the darkness that had enveloped him. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The intensity of the violence diminished, the nights became slightly less dreadful, and the air began to feel less heavy. The boys started to communicate with each other more, to offer each other support and understanding. The juvenile hall still felt like a prison, but the atmosphere was changing. The weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a nascent sense of hope. The arrival of Ms. Evans was more than just a change in staff, it was a turning point, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the potential for redemption even in the darkest of circumstances. It was a reminder that even in the depths of despair, there is always a possibility of hope, a glimmer of light waiting to be kindled. The boys' journey towards healing was a slow and arduous one, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but with Ms. Evans's unwavering support, they began to find their way towards a better future, one where the ghosts of their past mistakes no longer held them captive. The flicker of hope, initially faint, grew stronger, promising a brighter dawn. Chapter 4. Escape and Pursuit. The chipped paint on the wall seemed to mock Luis's meticulous calculations. He traced the escape route again with his finger, the faint smudge of dirt a testament to countless repetitions. The plan, scribbled in near illegible code on a torn scrap of paper, felt both audacious and terrifyingly fragile. 3 weeks they'd spent orchestrating it, whispers exchanged in the dead of night, furtive glances exchanged across the common room, a silent symphony of defiance against the oppressive walls of Juvie. Javier, his usual listlessness replaced by a focused intensity, meticulously checked the makeshift lockpick. He'd fashioned it from a bent hairpin, a testament to his ingenuity born from necessity. He tested it on a discarded can, the faint click a sound that sent a shiver of both excitement and terror through Luis. The stakes were impossibly high. Failure meant a return to the soul-crushing monotony of confinement, a tightening of the already suffocating grip of the system. Success, however, meant freedom, a chance to rewrite their destinies. Miguel, surprisingly, was the architect of the plan. His anger, once a self-destructive force, had been channeled into a cold, calculating precision. His initial sketches, frantic, almost chaotic expressions of his rage, had evolved into a detailed blueprint of their escape. He'd studied the guards' patrols, memorized their routines, identified the blind spots in their surveillance. His artistic talent, once a means of self-harm, had become a tool for survival, a weapon in their fight for freedom. He'd even crafted a distraction, a small, intricately designed model of the facility, complete with miniature guards and hidden passages. The escape wouldn't be easy. It was a complex operation, requiring precise timing, impeccable coordination, and a healthy dose of blind faith. The first hurdle was navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the juvenile hall, avoiding the ever-watchful eyes of the guards. Then, there was the outer perimeter fence, a formidable barrier topped with razor wire. The plan involved scaling the fence using makeshift climbing gear constructed from bedsheets and salvaged metal scraps. Even if they made it over the fence, the escape wouldn't be complete. They'd have to evade the patrol cars that patrolled the perimeter, vanish into the anonymity of the city. The weight of the plan pressed down on them, a suffocating pressure that amplified the tension in the air. Each whispered word, each furtive glance, was pregnant with risk. The silence between them was more potent than any shouted argument, a testament to the gravity of their undertaking. They had considered every possible contingency, every potential obstacle, but the inherent uncertainty still gnawed at them, a constant reminder of their precarious position. One of the biggest risks was betrayal. Trust, a commodity as rare as clean air in Juvie, was their most valuable asset, yet also their most vulnerable. They had chosen their team carefully, selecting only those they believed to be fiercely loyal, those who shared their desperate yearning for freedom. Yet, the ever-present shadow of doubt lingered, a constant reminder of the potential for treachery. A single lapse in loyalty, a single moment of weakness, could unravel their meticulously crafted plan. The night of the escape arrived like a thief in the shadows, cloaked in the inky blackness of a moonless sky. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant murmur of a guard's patrol. Javier, armed with his makeshift lockpick, worked silently, his movements fluid and precise. The lock clicked open with a barely audible sound. A wave of relief washed over them, quickly replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Their escape began, a silent ballet of shadows and whispers. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their movements honed by weeks of painstaking preparation. Miguel, their guide, led the way, his knowledge of the facility's layout proving invaluable. The journey through the labyrinthine corridors was tense, every footfall a potential giveaway, every stray sound a threat. The oppressive silence was heavy, a constant reminder of the consequences that awaited them if discovered. The air grew thick with anticipation, a silent acknowledgement of the risks they were taking. Reaching the fence, they worked quickly, efficiently. The bedsheet ropes felt flimsy and unreliable under the weight of their bodies, a constant reminder of the fragility of their plan. They ascended the fence, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the sweat on their skin. The razor wire was a treacherous obstacle, threatening to rip and tear their clothing and flesh. They climbed silently, each movement calculated to minimize noise and maximize speed. Reaching the top, they paused, momentarily gasping for breath, the lights of the city a distant promise of freedom. The descent was even more perilous, the risk of falling and injury ever present. They dropped to the ground, the impact jarring, but they were unharmed. They had escaped the walls of Juvie, but their journey was far from over. They now faced the challenge of navigating the city streets, evading the ever-watchful eyes of the authorities. The adrenaline was still coursing through their veins, a potent cocktail of fear and exhilaration. They ran, their hearts pounding like war drums against their ribs, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. They ran through the darkened streets, their senses heightened, every sound, every shadow, a potential threat. The city, usually a symbol of freedom, felt like a menacing labyrinth, every corner, every alleyway, a potential trap. They relied on instinct, their movements becoming fluid and intuitive. They navigated the city streets, weaving through the labyrinthine alleys and side streets. They knew they had to disappear into the anonymity of the city, to blend into the crowd and become unseen. They used their wits and guile to avoid detection, their adrenaline-fueled pace a constant reminder of the stakes. Suddenly, a siren pierced the night, a chilling sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through them. The sound seemed to cut through the night's silence, a cruel reminder of the proximity of law enforcement. The city, previously their sanctuary, had become a hunter's ground. They broke into a run, their pace growing more frantic, their breaths ragged. The pursuit was relentless, a deadly game of cat and mouse played under the cover of darkness. The police cars were relentless, their lights cutting through the city's darkness, casting long, ominous shadows. The sirens wailed relentlessly, a symphony of fear echoing through the city's night. They dodged and weaved through the city streets, the chase pushing them to their limits. Their escape route was a blur of hurried movements, desperate decisions, and narrow escapes. They dove into alleyways, scrambled over fences, and slipped through shadows. Each near miss felt like a victory, each close call a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The chase led them through a maze of city streets, a chaotic landscape of buildings and shadows, the constant sounds of pursuing sirens a relentless soundtrack to their desperate flight. They found themselves in a deserted part of town, a forgotten corner of the city where the night was especially dark and deep. Exhausted, desperate, and injured, they realized they couldn't run forever. They had to find a way to stop and regroup, to devise a new strategy. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, a crushing weight of fear and uncertainty. The city that held the promise of freedom now felt like a cage. The escape had been successful, but their journey was far from over. The freedom they sought was still beyond their grasp, and the chase was far from over. They huddled together, sharing a meager supply of food and water, their escape a victory only in a relative sense. The hunt was still on. Their fight for freedom continued. The weight of the chase hung heavy in the air, an ominous reminder that their troubles were far from over. The night was far from over, and their struggle for survival would continue. The city lights, once a promise of hope, now seemed to mock their precarious situation. Their fight for freedom had just begun. The rusty fire escape groaned under their weight, a discordant symphony accompanying their desperate scramble. Below, the city pulsed with a life they'd only glimpsed from the barred windows of Juvie. It was a chaotic tapestry of light and shadow, a vibrant contrast to the sterile, suffocating environment they'd just left behind. Miguel, ever the strategist, had chosen this route, a labyrinthine network of back alleys and forgotten streets that snaked through the heart of the city's underbelly. The air, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and damp concrete, stung their lungs. Each breath was a ragged gasp, a testament to their exertion. Javier, his usual smirk replaced by a grim determination, led the way, his knowledge of the city's hidden pathways a lifeline in this chaotic escape. Luis, his normally meticulous nature replaced by a primal urge for survival, clung to Javier's back, his breath hot on his neck. They were a blur of motion, shadows darting through the dimly lit streets, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The city, once a distant, unattainable dream, now felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The freedom it offered was intoxicating, but the dangers were equally palpable, lurking in every dark alleyway, every shadowed corner. They were trespassers in a world that didn't want them, outcasts running from a system that had failed them. The sound of sirens, distant at first, then growing closer, sharper, more menacing, sent a fresh wave of adrenaline surging through them. It was a relentless pursuit, a symphony of fear punctuated by the screech of tires and the blare of horns. The police cars, like predatory beasts, hunted them through the city's labyrinthine streets, their lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating their desperate flight. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, their bodies screaming for respite. Yet, they pushed onward, fueled by a mixture of terror and hope. The memory of the cold, hard walls of Juvie, the taste of bland institutional food, the endless monotony of their confinement, these served as a potent motivator, a driving force pushing them forward. They couldn't go back. They wouldn't go back. They dodged into a narrow alleyway, the stench of garbage and decay heavy in the air. The darkness offered a temporary refuge, a brief respite from the relentless pursuit. They pressed themselves against the cold, damp brick wall, their hearts hammering in their chests, listening to the approach of the police cars, their sirens a haunting soundtrack to their precarious situation. The alley was a claustrophobic maze, a claustrophobic world of discarded furniture and overflowing bins. The air was thick with the smell of rotting garbage and stagnant water, a testament to the city's neglected underbelly. They moved through it cautiously, their movements fluid and silent, their senses heightened. Every rustle, every creak, every shadow held the potential for discovery. Emerging from the alley, they found themselves in a bustling square, the sounds of the city's nocturnal life a cacophony of noise. People milled about, their lives seemingly oblivious to the desperate flight unfolding just meters away. The contrast between the urgency of their situation and the indifference of those around them was striking, a stark reminder of their isolation. They were invisible, yet hyper-visible. Ghosts in a city that didn't see them, yet pursued by a system that wouldn't let them go. The chase continued, a relentless game of cat and mouse played in the heart of the city. They weaved through the throngs of pedestrians, their movements fluid and unpredictable, using the crowds as both a shield and a means of disorientation. The city, a symbol of freedom and opportunity, now served as a treacherous landscape, a maze of potential traps and deadly encounters. They found refuge in a deserted park, the silence a welcome respite from the relentless cacophony of the chase. The moon, a pale orb in the inky sky, cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the grass. They collapsed onto the damp grass, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their minds racing. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a wave of profound weariness, a crushing weight of fear and uncertainty. Their escape had been a desperate gamble, a reckless act of defiance against a system that had failed them. They were free, at least for now, but the freedom they craved was still far from grasp. The city, which once promised hope and opportunity, now felt like a hostile territory, a landscape of shadows and uncertainty. Their journey was far from over. The pursuit, they knew, would continue. They rested for a while, sharing a meager supply of stolen snacks, their bodies racked with exhaustion. The sounds of the city, once a distant hum, were now an oppressive weight. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to them, a stark reminder of their precarious situation. They were alone, vulnerable, and exposed in a city that had never welcomed them. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray and purple, they knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The city, even in its quietest moments, was not a sanctuary. They had to find a way to disappear, to melt into the anonymity of the urban sprawl, to become unseen, unheard, and ultimately, safe. The weight of their past, the pressure of their present, and the uncertainty of their future hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to their desperate struggle for survival. The city was a canvas of contrasts. The vibrant energy of the day contrasted with the lingering shadows of the night, the affluence of certain neighborhoods juxtaposed with the stark poverty of others. This dichotomy mirrored their own internal struggles, the flicker of hope battling the overwhelming despair. They realized their escape, while successful in breaking free from Juvie, had merely shifted the battleground. Now, they faced a new challenge, navigating the complexities of the city, evading the relentless pursuit of law enforcement, and finding a way to rebuild their lives. Their freedom was precarious, their future uncertain. The weight of their choices, and the consequences of their actions, bore heavily on their young shoulders. The chase was far from over. Their fight for survival, for redemption, had just begun. The city, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a labyrinth of despair, a testing ground for their resilience, a crucible for their fate. The next move, they knew, was crucial. Their lives hung in the balance. The park's false serenity shattered with the screech of tires on asphalt. Headlights sliced through the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating their huddled forms. The illusion of safety evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty. They were cornered. Javier, the street-smart leader, reacted instantly, shoving Luis and Miguel behind a sprawling oak tree. The rough bark scraped against their skin, a minor pain compared to the icy grip of fear that constricted their chests. The air crackled with tension. The silence, broken only by the rustling leaves and their ragged breathing, was a suffocating blanket. 3 police cruisers surrounded them, their lights a hypnotic dance of red and blue. Officers emerged, their faces grim, weapons drawn. The shouts were sharp, peremptory, the commands echoing in the stillness. The world narrowed to the immediate threat, the cold steel glinting in the weak light. Resistance was futile. The arrest was swift, brutal, and devoid of ceremony. They were wrestled to the ground, their limbs twisted, their bodies aching from exhaustion and the fresh onslaught of force. The taste of dirt and gravel filled their mouths. The humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. The fleeting taste of freedom, that intoxicating rush of rebellion, turned to ash in their mouths. Handcuffs, cold and unforgiving, clamped around their wrists. The metallic bite was a painful reminder of their captivity. The walk back to the juvenile detention center was a silent procession of shame, a parade of defeat under the judging eyes of the rising sun. The familiar gates of Juvie loomed, their rusty hinges groaning a mournful song. It was as if the very structure exhaled a sigh of relief, its grim embrace welcoming them back. The cold, sterile air hit them like a physical blow, washing away the lingering remnants of the city's grime and the false promise of escape. The processing was swift, efficient, and dehumanizing. Fingerprinting, mug shots, the tedious recitation of personal details, a ritual of degradation they knew all too well. Their clothes were confiscated, replaced with the familiar drab uniform, their individuality stripped away, replaced by the uniformity of incarceration. Their cell, small and stark, felt even more confining after their brief taste of freedom. The cold concrete floor, the thin mattress, the stale air, all served as harsh reminders of their failure. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating them with the weight of their predicament. The silence, broken only by the distant sounds of other inmates, was a heavy cloak of despair. Miguel, usually the optimistic one, sat hunched in a corner, his shoulders slumped. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, were dull with resignation. He had tried to paint a future for them, a vision of a world beyond Juvie's walls, a world where hope wasn't a cruel joke. Now, that hope felt crushed under the weight of reality. Javier, his usual swagger gone, stared blankly at the wall. The escape, planned with meticulous care, had been a disastrous failure. His street smarts, his intimate knowledge of the city's underbelly, had been useless against the overwhelming power of the system. His quiet desperation was palpable. Luis, usually the cautious one, the quiet observer, wept silently. The tears, hot and bitter, spoke of a despair deeper than words could express. His dreams, always fragile, seemed to have completely shattered. The following days were a blur of monotonous routine. The food was bland, the work was meaningless, the atmosphere oppressive. They were stripped of any agency, their lives dictated by the relentless rhythm of the facility. The psychological impact of their recapture was heavier than the physical punishments that followed. Their escape attempt resulted in extended sentences, harsh disciplinary actions, and solitary confinement. The consequences were swift and brutal, a testament to the unforgiving nature of the juvenile justice system. The system, which had failed them, now punished them for their attempt to escape its grip. The irony was not lost on them. Solitary confinement was a particularly cruel punishment. The isolation, the crushing silence, the lack of human contact, it chipped away at their sanity. The days blurred into one another, an endless cycle of despair and hopelessness. The small cell became a prison for their minds, a place where their deepest fears and insecurities festered and grew. Their spirits, already battered by years of hardship and neglect, were further broken by the harsh realities of their recapture. The optimism they'd briefly felt during their escape was replaced by a profound sense of defeat. The weight of their past mistakes, compounded by the failure of their attempt at freedom, felt almost unbearable. The cycle of incarceration, they realized, was a vicious one, difficult to escape. Their initial confinement had led to the desperate escape. That escape, in turn, led to an even harsher confinement. It was a pattern they felt trapped within, a relentless cycle of despair and self-destruction. The system, they now understood, was not designed for rehabilitation but for containment. Their fate, they realized, was intertwined with the system's failures. The systemic issues that had led them to Juvie in the first place were now working to keep them there, making any prospect of redemption seem impossibly remote. Their story, they realized, was not just about their individual failings but also about the broader systemic issues contributing to the cycle of poverty, violence, and incarceration that trapped young men like them. It was a story of missed opportunities, of shattered dreams, and of a system that often prioritized punishment over rehabilitation. Their escape and its consequences served as a stark reminder of the uphill battle they faced, the long road ahead before any possibility of redemption, any glimmer of a future beyond the walls of Juvie, might materialize. Their fight for survival, for a better life, was far from over, but it felt, in that desolate cell, heavier than ever. The silence in the cell was a thick, suffocating blanket, heavier now than the weight of the concrete walls. Javier, his face etched with a weariness that belied his young age, stared at the chipped paint on the wall, the pattern a mocking reflection of the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade of control. The escape, his escape, had been a colossal failure. Not just a failure of execution, but a failure of judgment, a failure of trust. He'd envisioned a clean break, a swift flight into the anonymity of the city, a chance to reinvent themselves. Instead, they were back, deeper in the mire than before, their sentences extended, their spirits crushed. The added time felt like a life sentence. The failure wasn't just a logistical one. It was a failure of his leadership, a stark revelation that even his street smarts, honed on the unforgiving streets of the city, were no match for the cold, calculated machinery of the juvenile justice system. He'd underestimated the system's reach, its relentless pursuit. He'd also underestimated the fragility of the bonds he'd forged with Luis and Miguel. Luis, the quiet observer, had always been the voice of reason, the anchor of their little group. Now, his eyes held a chilling emptiness, a void where hope once resided. The escape, fueled by a desperate yearning for freedom, had exposed the deep fissures of their strained camaraderie. Luis's quiet despair was a constant, painful reminder of Javier's failure. He saw the silent accusations in Luis's eyes, a judgment that cut deeper than any disciplinary action. Miguel, usually the beacon of optimism, was a shadow of his former self. His vibrant spirit, once a defiant flame in the darkness of Juvie, had been snuffed out. The weight of their failed escape, the harsh reality of their extended confinement, had crushed him. His silence was more deafening than any shouted accusation. The dreams he'd painted, the future he'd envisioned, were now as desolate as their cell. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the sounds that echoed from other parts of the facility, the rhythmic clang of a metal door, the muffled cries of other inmates, the distant shouts of guards. Each sound was a sharp reminder of their captivity, their vulnerability. The betrayal hadn't come from outside, from the officers who had hunted them down. The betrayal had come from within, from the cracks that had formed during their desperate, ultimately futile attempt to escape. It was a betrayal that ran deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement of the inadequacy of their plan, of the strength of the system they had tried to defy. Javier recalled the moments leading up to the arrest, the frantic scramble in the park, the feeling of abandonment that had gripped him when he saw Miguel hesitate, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was a split second, but that hesitation had cost them everything. Miguel's uncertainty had become the catalyst for their capture. The ensuing days were a tortuous blend of isolation and simmering tension. The routine was monotonous, each day a pale imitation of the last, each meal a bland, tasteless reminder of their imprisonment. The work assignments were demeaning, pointless tasks designed to drain their energy, their spirit. The psychological toll was far heavier than any physical punishment. The tension between the three boys grew palpable, a thick, suffocating fog that hung in the air between them. Accusations, unspoken yet deeply felt, hung heavy in the stale air of their cell. Javier found himself analyzing their escape plan, picking it apart, searching for the fatal flaw that had led to their downfall. He'd trusted Miguel, had relied on his street smarts, his instincts. It was a decision he now deeply regretted. Miguel, in turn, retreated further into himself, his silence a formidable barrier. He wasn't overtly hostile, but his withdrawal, his avoidance of eye contact, was more painful than any direct confrontation. The weight of his perceived responsibility for the failure of the escape weighed heavily on him. Luis, the ever-observant one, watched them both, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. He understood their internal struggle, the shifting sands of their alliances. The escape had not only failed, it had fractured their fragile bond, leaving them more isolated than ever before. His silence was a testament to his disillusionment, a heartbreaking acceptance of their fate. Solitary confinement, the punishment for their failed attempt, was a different kind of hell. The isolation was a crushing weight, a slow, agonizing erosion of their minds. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet, was a relentless torment. The stark walls seemed to close in, suffocating them with the weight of their guilt, their regret, their despair. In the suffocating solitude, Javier grappled with his own demons. The responsibility for their capture weighed heavily upon him, the crushing realization that he had failed not only himself but also his friends. The facade of strength he usually projected crumbled under the weight of his internal conflict. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a failure. He was the leader who had led them to their doom. The memories of the escape, the adrenaline rush, the fleeting taste of freedom, now felt like a cruel taunt. The bitter truth was undeniable. The system they had tried to outrun had swallowed them whole, and their shared experience had only deepened the chasm between them. Their escape had failed, and their relationships had broken down. They were alone, together, in the crushing confines of Juvie. The internal struggle wasn't just between Javier, Miguel, and Luis. It was a battle waged within each of them, a war between hope and despair, between the desire for redemption and the overwhelming weight of their past mistakes. Their shared ordeal had exposed their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, shattering the illusion of solidarity they'd clung to in their brief moments of freedom. The system, designed for punishment, not rehabilitation, had once again prevailed, leaving them trapped in a cycle of despair, their prospects for a better future dimmed further by their failures. The relentless monotony of their confinement, the constant psychological pressure, and the crushing weight of their failed escape would test the bonds of their friendship and their own resilience to the breaking point. The escape attempt had not set them free, it had only chained them tighter, and they were not the same boys who had stepped out into that pre-dawn darkness. The bitter truth was settling in, their fight for freedom had only brought them closer to defeat. The stale air of the cell hung heavy, thick with the residue of despair. But even in this suffocating environment, a subtle shift was occurring. It wasn't a dramatic change, no sudden burst of sunlight piercing the gloom, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible thawing of the frozen ground of their despair. It began with a small act, an almost insignificant gesture. Miguel, the once vibrant soul reduced to a shadow, picked up a discarded pencil stub. He hadn't spoken in days, his silence a wall impenetrable even to Luis, usually his closest confidant. Now, with a tentative hand, he began to sketch on the back of a discarded food wrapper. It wasn't a masterpiece, a crude rendering of a bird, perhaps a sparrow, its wings outstretched in flight. But in that simple sketch, a flicker of the old Miguel re-emerged, a spark of life in the ashes of their failed escape. Javier, observing from across the small cell, noticed the change. The subtle movement of Miguel's hand, the almost imperceptible furrow in his brow as he focused on his drawing, stirred something within him. He'd expected continued silence, continued withdrawal. Instead, there was this small, fragile act of creation, a testament to a resilience he hadn't anticipated. It was a crack in the dam of despair, a hint of hope. Luis, ever the observant one, saw it too. He didn't intrude, didn't offer encouragement, but his eyes softened, a slight easing of the permanent weariness that had settled upon his features. The tension in the cell, though still present, seemed less suffocating, less heavy. The following days brought a series of small changes. Miguel continued to draw, filling the backs of discarded food wrappers with his creations, birds in flight, stylized portraits of their fellow inmates, abstract shapes that seemed to capture the chaotic energy of their confinement. He didn't offer them to anyone, not yet, but the act itself was a breakthrough, a subtle rebellion against the crushing weight of their surroundings. One day, he carefully drew a picture of Javier, capturing his weary expression with an unexpected accuracy. He then, with a tentative movement, slid the drawing across the floor to Javier. It was a simple act, devoid of words, yet it spoke volumes. It was an apology, an acknowledgement of shared failure, a quiet affirmation of their continued bond. Javier, surprised by the gesture, found himself reacting with a small, almost imperceptible nod. The unspoken acknowledgement broke the ice, a slow but steady thaw in the frigid atmosphere of their shared cell. The conversations remained sparse, but the silence was no longer a crushing weight. There was an understanding, a shared understanding of their past failures and the present struggle, a silent agreement that they had to work together, not against each other. One afternoon, a new counselor arrived on their unit. He was young, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that differed from the harshness of the other guards and staff. He introduced himself as Mr. Ramirez and spoke to the boys not as delinquents but as young men facing difficult challenges. He spoke of rehabilitation programs, educational opportunities, and the possibility of a brighter future. His words were unexpected. Their prior experiences with authority figures had left them deeply cynical, yet Mr. Ramirez's sincerity resonated differently. It was a message of hope, a possibility previously unimaginable within the confines of Juvie. It fueled the small flicker of hope that had begun to ignite within the three boys. Mr. Ramirez's approach was unique. He didn't focus on punishment, but on rehabilitation. He introduced art therapy sessions, offering the boys a creative outlet for their frustrations and anxieties. He encouraged them to participate in educational programs, offering them a path towards a future beyond the walls of Juvie. He talked to them about their aspirations, offering encouragement, rather than judgment. His gentle guidance was a stark contrast to their previous encounters with authority. This time, their efforts were directed towards a shared goal, earning privileges. They began studying together, helping each other with schoolwork, motivating each other to stay focused despite the distractions. The competition that had simmered between them during their escape attempt was replaced by a shared desire to prove themselves. They were no longer rivals, but a team, their shared ambition replacing their simmering resentment. The art therapy sessions became a surprising catalyst for change. Through their art, they explored their emotions, their fears, their aspirations, their shared trauma. Miguel's drawings evolved from simple sketches to vibrant, emotive pieces, capturing the raw emotions that had been buried deep within him. Javier, who had never shown an interest in art, began to express his thoughts and feelings through charcoal sketches. And Luis, who had always been the voice of reason, found a new way to express his quiet observations through detailed watercolor paintings. Their progress didn't go unnoticed. Mr. Ramirez's positive reinforcement, coupled with their newfound collaboration, began to change the dynamics of their cell and their interactions with other inmates. They became beacons of hope in the grim reality of juvenile detention. They began to inspire others. Their shared struggle to overcome their past mistakes provided a powerful example for their peers. Their newfound collaboration even extended beyond their cell. They began to tutor other inmates who struggled with academics, sharing their newfound knowledge and skills. They found that helping others was a way to heal themselves, to move past the guilt and regret of their failed escape. In this act of service, they rediscovered a sense of purpose and worth. The escape attempt had been a catastrophic failure, but it also proved to be an unexpected catalyst for change. It had exposed their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, but it had also revealed their resilience, their capacity for growth. Their shared experience of failure had forged a new bond between them, a bond stronger than the one that had been broken by their attempted escape. This bond became the foundation for their shared hope. They had fallen, but they had also learned to rise. They were now looking toward a future beyond the walls of Juvie, a future that they were building, brick by painful brick, together. The future was uncertain, the road ahead arduous, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, they might escape the cycle of despair that had trapped them. The path to redemption would not be easy, but they now faced it together, united by a shared past and a renewed sense of purpose, their collective strength overcoming the pain and despair of their failed escape. Their journey had been a harrowing descent into despair, but from the depths of that darkness, a new hope had begun to dawn. Chapter 5. Redemption and Loss. The rhythmic clang of the metal door, a sound that had initially filled them with dread, now served as a strangely comforting metronome to their days. The monotony of Juvie, once a suffocating blanket, now offered a strange sort of solace. It was within this structured chaos that the boys began to confront the ghosts of their pasts. It started subtly, with Miguel. His drawings, once simply a way to pass the time, became more intense, more personal. They were no longer just birds and abstract shapes. They were visceral representations of his memories, a shadowy figure looming over a younger him, a clenched fist, a broken window reflecting a distorted image of his own face. He didn't share them at first, keeping them tucked away, small treasures in a world that offered few. But the act of creation itself was cathartic, a slow, painstaking peeling away of layers of trauma. Javier, watching Miguel's quiet intensity, found himself drawn into the process. He'd always been the pragmatist, the one who kept his emotions locked tight. But seeing Miguel's vulnerability, his willingness to confront his pain, stirred something within him. He started writing, filling notebooks with raw, unfiltered emotions. He wrote about his absent father, the constant pressure to provide for his younger siblings, the gnawing shame that had pushed him towards the edges of society. His words, poured out onto the page, were a confession, a release. Luis, the quiet observer, found his way through the memories through painting. His watercolors, initially tentative and hesitant, grew bolder, more expressive. He painted the bustling, chaotic streets of his neighborhood, the vibrant yet dangerous world that had shaped him. He painted the faces of his friends, the faces of those he'd lost, capturing the complexities of their lives with a startling honesty. His art, a quiet testament to the realities of their existence. Mr. Ramirez, their new counselor, understood this unspoken need for self-expression. He encouraged them, providing a safe space for them to delve into their pasts without judgment. He arranged for individual therapy sessions, offering each of them a chance to unpack their experiences with a trained professional. He didn't press, he listened, allowing them to reveal their vulnerabilities at their own pace. He understood the systemic failures that had contributed to their plight, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the absence of strong positive male role models in their lives. Through therapy, Miguel began to understand the roots of his anger. He spoke of his abusive stepfather, the constant fear that permeated his childhood, the deep-seated resentment that had fueled his impulsive actions. He spoke of the weight of unspoken expectations, the crushing pressure to be the man his family desperately needed him to be. The weight of those expectations had ultimately led him to breaking point. He discovered a path towards forgiveness, not just for his actions but for the role these past events played. Javier's sessions revealed a complex picture of neglect and responsibility. He spoke of his mother's struggles with addiction, her inability to provide a stable home, the burden he had shouldered from a young age. He spoke of the constant need to survive, the choices he had made to protect his siblings, the subtle corruption of his morals under such pressure. He revealed the deep sadness behind his hard exterior, the loneliness of a young boy forced to mature too quickly. The weight of responsibility had driven his decision-making in unhealthy and ultimately damaging ways. Luis, ever the pragmatist, acknowledged the circumstances that had led him to Juvie, yet he also took responsibility for his choices. He spoke of the allure of easy money, the temptation of the fast life, the gradual descent into a world he'd initially sought to resist. He didn't offer excuses, merely a clear-eyed account of his own flaws and vulnerabilities. He understood that his actions had had consequences and would continue to do so. Their shared vulnerability, their willingness to confront their pasts, fostered a new kind of camaraderie. They were not just cellmates, they were brothers in arms, united in their struggle for redemption. They supported each other, sharing their triumphs and setbacks, offering words of encouragement and comfort. Their shared experiences created an unbreakable bond. The memories, once a source of shame and despair, became a foundation for healing, a testament to their resilience and strength. The flashbacks, initially fragmented and chaotic, began to coalesce into a coherent narrative. They saw the patterns, the systemic failures that had contributed to their current predicament: broken homes, absent parents, poverty, lack of educational opportunities, the seductive lure of street life, a cycle of violence and despair passed down through generations. They saw themselves not as individuals responsible for their failures alone, but as products of their environment, victims and perpetrators in an intricate dance of trauma and circumstance. They began to see the world with new eyes. The faces of their victims, initially obscured by guilt and anger, started to come into focus. They began to understand the pain they had caused, the ripple effects of their actions, the lingering sense of grief and loss. They learned to sit in that grief without shame, accepting their role in the chaos. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of anger and self-doubt, times when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm them. But they had each other, their shared experiences, their newfound sense of purpose. They had found a way to transform their past trauma into a source of strength and resilience. The sessions weren't just about facing the past, they were about forging a path to a better future. Mr. Ramirez was instrumental in this process. He was more than just a counselor, he was a mentor, a guide, a beacon of hope in their otherwise bleak world. He connected them with resources, helping them access educational programs, job training, and counseling services beyond Juvie. He helped them find a path toward their release and a better life. Their journey was far from over. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, paved with challenges and obstacles. But for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of agency, a belief in their capacity to change, to heal, and to become better versions of themselves. They had faced their pasts, not to wallow in regret, but to learn from their mistakes and rebuild their futures. They were beginning to understand the nuances of grief and trauma, understanding the complexities of victim and perpetrator. This understanding was fundamental to their recovery. They understood their journey wouldn't be quick or easy. It would take time, patience, and unwavering support. It would require a willingness to confront themselves and the difficult truths about the past. The process was painful, but essential. The future remained uncertain, but the boys faced it together, united by a shared past and a renewed sense of hope. They had fallen, but they were rising, not as individuals, but as a collective, a force for change, their shared strength and resilience a beacon in the darkness. The shared experience of trauma had forged an unbreakable bond, creating a support network far more powerful than the individual strength of each boy. They had created a network of brotherhood within the confines of Juvie, a testament to their resilience, a foundation for their shared future. The path to redemption was long and arduous, but they were walking it together, shoulder to shoulder, facing the world, and their pasts, with renewed courage and strength. Their journey was a testament to the power of hope, the enduring strength of the human spirit, and the transformative power of shared experience. The future remained unwritten, but it held the promise of a new beginning, a brighter dawn after the long, dark night. The visiting room felt smaller than Miguel remembered, the air thick with the cloying scent of disinfectant and simmering tension. His mother sat across from him, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. He hadn't seen her since it happened, since he'd lost his temper, that explosion of rage that had shattered more than just a window. It had shattered their relationship, leaving behind a jagged landscape of guilt and unspoken words. He'd practiced what he wanted to say 100 times in his head, the words tumbling over each other like panicked birds. "I'm sorry," was the simplest, yet the hardest phrase to utter. It felt inadequate, a flimsy raft in a sea of regret. But it was a start. He'd spent months in therapy unpacking the rage, the years of simmering resentment towards his stepfather, the suffocating weight of responsibility he'd carried since he was a boy. He'd learned to separate the anger from the man he was, to understand that his actions, however justifiable they felt at the time, were wrong. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sterile room. "Mama," he began, his voice barely a whisper. His mother looked at him, her gaze a mixture of pain and something else. Was it hope? He couldn't be sure. He continued, pouring out the words he'd rehearsed, adding details, context, explaining the years of simmering anger that had built up. He spoke of the fear, the constant threat of violence, the weight of his family's expectations. He spoke of the pressure to be the man he wasn't yet ready to be, the overwhelming sense of responsibility that crushed his spirit. He spoke of the shame, the crushing weight of his actions, and the terrible consequences that had unfolded. He spoke of his regret, of the deep remorse that gnawed at him day and night. He didn't expect absolution, only understanding. He wanted her to see the years of hurt, the years of trauma and suppressed emotions, that built up to that fateful night. He wanted her to understand, not excuse, but comprehend the weight of his past. He wanted to convey the complex reality of his situation. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. His mother listened, her eyes fixed on him, her expression unreadable. There were tears welling up, but whether they were tears of sorrow, relief, or anger, he couldn't tell. When he finally fell silent, the silence hung heavy between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. He braced himself for her anger, for the torrent of accusations he deserved. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she took his. "Miguel," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I know you're not the boy who broke that window. I know what you've been through." Her words were a lifeline, pulling him from the depths of his despair. The weight on his chest lessened. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the trauma that had shaped him. Javier's path to redemption was different. His wasn't about physical violence, but about betrayal, a violation of trust that had ripped apart his community and sent shockwaves through the lives of those he'd once considered his friends. He'd sold out his friends, traded their secrets for a fleeting sense of belonging, a misguided attempt to earn acceptance. Now, he had to face the consequences. He wrote a long letter, a confession to the one person he'd hurt most, Marco, the boy whose life had been irrevocably altered by Javier's actions. He poured his heart out, not seeking forgiveness, but hoping for understanding. He explained the desperation that had driven him, the crippling fear of being ostracized, the desperation for a sense of validation in a world that had consistently let him down. He spoke of his mother's addiction, the constant uncertainty of their lives, the need to survive, to provide for his younger siblings. He didn't excuse his actions, but sought to help Marco understand the context of his betrayal. He detailed the crushing loneliness, the pervasive sense of worthlessness that had pushed him towards a path he now deeply regretted. It was a confession, a bare admission of his mistakes, a desperate plea for understanding rather than outright forgiveness. He knew he couldn't undo the damage, but he hoped to offer some semblance of clarity, some small measure of closure. Delivering the letter was the hardest part. The anticipation, the uncertainty, gnawed at him. He hoped that Marco wouldn't just crumple it up and throw it away. He had the chance for Marco to understand his actions, but ultimately, only Marco could decide to forgive him. The process was slow and arduous, marked by moments of hope and despair. It was a testament to the complexities of healing and the unpredictable nature of human relationships. Luis's journey was more internal. He had no one specific to seek forgiveness from, only himself and perhaps the shadow of the life he'd almost succumbed to. He'd faced his demons and accepted the consequences, the incarceration being just one part of the price he had to pay. He'd chosen to take responsibility for his own actions, rather than blame others or the circumstances of his past. This internal redemption was a quiet, solitary struggle, a quiet battle against his own inner demons. It involved facing his own internal turmoil, working through his anger, and understanding the consequences of his decisions. He accepted responsibility for his actions, and recognized the necessity of atonement. He understood he couldn't simply ask for forgiveness. He had to work for it, to demonstrate his commitment to change through consistent actions and responsible behavior. He focused on his art, pouring his remorse and newfound understanding onto canvas, transforming his pain into something beautiful and meaningful. It was a way of working through his guilt, of acknowledging his mistakes, and of finding peace with himself. He didn't expect external absolution. His redemption was a personal journey, a slow, painstaking process of self-discovery, an internal struggle against his own demons. Their paths diverged, but their shared experiences in Juvie served as a common thread. They'd all faced the consequences of their actions, confronted their pasts, and made tentative steps towards a better future. The road to redemption was far from over, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but they walked it together, their bond forged in the crucible of shared trauma, their spirits tempered by adversity. They had sought forgiveness, not necessarily to erase the past, but to start building a different kind of future. The future remained unclear, but it wasn't clouded by the same darkness it once had been. The possibility of redemption, the potential for healing and reconciliation, was a glimmer of light in their sometimes bleak world. It was the beginning of a long and arduous process, but they were moving forward. They had started to learn that forgiveness, in its many forms, both given and received, was an essential part of the healing process, not just for them, but for those they had wronged. They understood that true redemption wasn't a single event, but a process, a continued effort towards positive change. And that process was just beginning. The visiting room was a sterile box, but for Miguel, it held a fragile hope. His mother's hand in his, a silent promise, a tentative bridge across the chasm their fight had created. It wasn't just forgiveness he sought, it was understanding, a recognition of the years of simmering resentment, the weight of a broken home, a stepfather's violence that had left scars deeper than any physical wound. The therapy sessions had helped him untangle the knots of his rage, to see that it wasn't simply his anger, but the culmination of years of pain, the pressure to be the provider, the man of the house, he never wanted to be. He'd learned to separate the boy he was then, from the man he was becoming, even within the suffocating walls of Juvenile Hall. Leaving the visiting room, he felt a lightness he hadn't anticipated. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but it was there. He walked through the corridors, the harsh fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the fleeting warmth of his mother's touch. His steps seemed lighter, his shoulders less burdened. But the world outside the visiting room still felt heavy. His future, though less clouded by the immediate darkness, remained uncertain. That uncertainty was shared by many of the boys. Javier, still grappling with the repercussions of his betrayal, found an unexpected ally in Ms. Rodriguez, a social worker who had been assigned to their group. Initially, he saw her as another authority figure, a cog in the vast, uncaring machine of the juvenile justice system. But Ms. Rodriguez saw something different in him, something beyond the act of betrayal. She saw a boy drowning in despair, desperately seeking validation, a victim of circumstance and poverty. She began to visit Javier regularly, not to judge or lecture, but to listen. She offered him quiet understanding, a patient ear in a world that had largely ignored him. She didn't condone his actions, but she attempted to understand the desperation that fueled them, the pressure of providing for his family, his mother's struggles with addiction. She helped him see the possibility of redemption, not as a magical fix, but as a long, arduous journey. Her empathy was a lifeline. It was a stark contrast to the coldness he'd encountered from many other adults in his life. Ms. Rodriguez didn't offer empty platitudes or promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she provided practical support, helping him access educational resources, connecting him with mentors, encouraging him to express his feelings through writing. Her support was more than just listening. It was practical, guiding him toward real, tangible steps toward change. She challenged him to confront the hurt he'd caused, not simply for the sake of absolution, but to learn from his mistakes. She helped him understand the importance of taking responsibility for his actions without being consumed by guilt. Luis, the quiet artist, found solace in an unlikely place, the art therapy sessions. It wasn't just about the creative process, it was about self-expression, a way to navigate the inner turmoil that had led to his actions. He'd found a quiet strength in his art, a way to translate his regret and pain into something beautiful, something meaningful. His artwork became a reflection of his journey, his struggles, his slow, painstaking process of self-forgiveness. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, it was purely a personal process, a way to connect with his inner self. One day, during an art therapy session, a visiting artist, Mr. Evans, noticed Luis's work. Mr. Evans had a reputation for his gritty realism, his ability to capture the raw emotion of his subjects. He recognized something profound in Luis's work, a deep understanding of pain and resilience. Mr. Evans didn't offer Luis empty compliments. Instead, he challenged him, pushing him to explore his emotions more deeply, to go beyond the surface, to confront the ugliness he'd buried within himself. He shared his own experiences, his struggles with addiction, his battles with self-doubt, building a connection based on shared vulnerabilities. Mr. Evans's mentorship wasn't a simple one. It was fraught with moments of tension, moments when Luis's past threatened to overwhelm him. But Mr. Evans's belief in Luis's potential, his willingness to invest time and energy into him, was a significant turning point. It showed Luis that his pain, his struggle, were not a burden to be hidden, but experiences that could be transformed into something powerful and beautiful. The guidance he received, the quiet understanding and belief in his talent, nurtured his spirit, giving him a hope that had been absent in his life before. These unexpected allies, Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Evans, weren't miracle workers. They didn't erase the past or magically solve all their problems. But they offered something far more valuable, a hand to hold, a guiding voice in the darkness, a belief in their potential for change. They showed that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about moving forward, about using their experiences to build a better future. The boys found unexpected camaraderie as well. Initially, they'd only seen each other as rivals, their lives intertwined by shared experiences in Juvie but separate in their own personal struggles. But the collective journey of facing their consequences began to forge an unlikely bond. They started to find common ground, not in their crimes, but in their shared humanity, their vulnerability, their desire for a better future. They shared stories, not of their past glories, but of their deepest regrets, their most profound fears, their hopes for a different life. Miguel, Javier, and Luis were different, their crimes stemming from different motives and situations. Yet, in the crucible of their shared confinement and their individual journeys toward redemption, they started to see each other as not only fellow inmates but as companions on a difficult path. They saw the shared pain, the collective struggle toward self-improvement, and the desire for a better future. These unlikely alliances didn't erase the harsh realities of their situation. They still faced challenges, setbacks, and moments of despair. But these connections, these glimmers of hope, gave them the strength to persevere, to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain and filled with obstacles. It demonstrated that human connection, the power of empathy and understanding, could be a powerful catalyst for change. It showed them that even in the darkest corners of society, kindness, belief, and human connection could offer a path to redemption. The bonds they forged, unexpected and fragile, were a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the capacity for healing and hope even in the most challenging circumstances. The road to redemption was still long, but they were walking it together, their steps steadier, their spirits lighter, guided not only by their own strength but by the unexpected allies who had believed in them when they had almost given up on themselves. The future remained unwritten, but it was filled with a possibility that had once seemed distant and unattainable. The visiting room's sterile scent clung to Miguel like a second skin, even after he'd left. The lightness he'd felt, the fragile hope sparked by his mother's visit, began to dissipate. The weight of his reality pressed down again, heavier than before. It wasn't just the concrete walls, the constant surveillance, or the restrictions of Juvie. It was the gnawing emptiness, the void left by the absence of his older brother, Marco. Marco, a whirlwind of chaotic energy and misguided loyalty, had been the only constant in Miguel's tumultuous life. He was the one who'd taught him how to box, how to defend himself in the rough streets of their neighborhood, a survival skill set passed down through generations. He'd been the older brother who, despite his flaws, had always been there. Marco had been the one who understood the simmering anger, the frustration of their poverty, the silent screams trapped within their broken home. Now, he was gone. Marco hadn't been a victim of a violent crime or a tragic accident. His death was self-inflicted, a brutal culmination of the same struggles that had landed Miguel in Juvie. Overdose. The word echoed in Miguel's mind, a cold, hollow sound that mocked the warmth of his mother's touch. He'd received the news in a terse, emotionless message from a cousin. No funeral, no proper goodbye, just the crushing weight of his brother's absence, the knowledge that his own anger, his own desperation, mirrored Marco's fatal descent. The news spread through Juvenile Hall like wildfire. Javier, despite his own troubles, felt a strange kinship with Miguel's grief. He'd lost his mother to addiction years ago, the vacant space she'd left in his life still ached. He found Miguel in the yard, sitting alone, the usual vibrant energy drained from him, replaced by a heavy, desolate silence. Javier sat beside him, not offering platitudes or hollow words of comfort, but simply sharing the quiet burden of loss. Luis, usually lost in the world of his art, found himself unable to create. His sketchbook lay untouched, the once vibrant colors now muted, mirroring the gray despair that had settled over him. He'd never known Marco, but he understood Miguel's pain. He'd lost his father when he was a child, a loss shrouded in silence, a grief that never fully healed. He knew that this was not the silence of acceptance, but of the deep, soul-wrenching pain of loss, the deafening quiet after the storm of despair has ravaged everything. The art therapy sessions became a refuge, but not a source of comfort. Luis's artwork morphed into dark, brooding landscapes, reflecting the collective grief that had settled over the boys. Mr. Evans, sensing the shift in Luis's demeanor, didn't pressure him to paint something uplifting or positive. He simply sat beside him, a silent witness to his pain, offering a steadying presence in the maelstrom of emotions. He understood the language of grief, having lived through his own periods of darkness. He knew that art wasn't always about beauty or escape. Sometimes, it was about confronting the ugliness within, acknowledging the pain, and finding a way to navigate it. Ms. Rodriguez, noticing the palpable shift in mood amongst the boys, adjusted her approach. She organized a grief support group, a safe space where the boys could share their feelings without judgment. It was a slow, arduous process, filled with tears, anger, and denial. She guided them through the stages of grief, helping them understand that their pain was valid, that their grief wasn't something to be ashamed of. She helped them begin to talk about Marco, not just as a lost brother but as a complex human being, warts and all. They discussed memories of Marco, both good and bad, accepting the entirety of his existence. The sessions were far from easy, the raw emotions were often overwhelming, but the collective sharing, the recognition of their shared pain, started to forge a stronger bond among them. The loss of Marco extended beyond the immediate circle of his friends. It resonated through the entire Juvenile Hall, a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the pervasive shadow of despair that hung over their lives. It highlighted the systemic failures that had contributed to Marco's downward spiral, the lack of resources, the absence of meaningful support, the crushing weight of poverty and hopelessness. It served as a harsh reminder that the path to redemption was a precarious one, easily derailed by the insidious forces of despair. It was a sobering realization for all the boys. They saw in Marco's death a reflection of their own vulnerabilities, the ever-present threat that loomed over their lives, the constant battle against addiction, poverty, and violence. The visiting room, once a symbol of fragile hope, now felt like a mausoleum. The boys' shared experience of loss created a peculiar kind of camaraderie, a bond forged in the fires of collective grief. They found solace in each other's company, sharing stories of Marco, of their shared traumas, acknowledging the darkness they carried within. They learned to grieve together, supporting each other through the darkest hours, recognizing that their pain, though intensely personal, was also a shared experience. This collective grief helped them to feel less isolated and alone, understanding that they were not alone in navigating the treacherous waters of their pasts and present struggles. Their stories, intertwined through the threads of shared loss and redemption, began to weave a tapestry of resilience, proving that even in the face of devastation, the human spirit could find a way to persevere. The shared grief became a catalyst for change. It forced them to confront their own demons, to acknowledge the choices that led them to Juvie, and to consider the consequences of their actions. They realized that their actions had not only affected their lives but also had ripples of impact on the lives of others. Marco's death was a stark reminder of this. The collective grief started to foster a renewed determination, a shared resolve to make a change in their lives, to break free from the cycles of violence, addiction, and despair that had claimed Marco. Their bond, strengthened by grief and loss, became a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the dark abyss of their circumstances. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for healing and the power of human connection in overcoming the darkest chapters of life. The journey to redemption wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon, each step forward marked by both their individual struggles and their shared triumphs. Their future was still uncertain, but now, they faced it together, their spirits tempered by loss, yet bound together by a common goal, to avoid the same fate that had claimed Marco. The loss, as devastating as it was, ultimately became the crucible where a stronger, more enduring bond was formed, a testament to the human capacity for empathy, resilience, and the profound healing power of shared grief. The air in the group therapy session hung heavy, thick with the unspoken anxieties of their futures. Ms. Rodriguez, ever perceptive, shifted the focus from Marco's memory to the looming reality of their impending release. The silence that followed was not the silence of despair this time, but a pregnant pause, filled with the weight of decisions yet to be made. Miguel, surprisingly, was the first to speak. The hollow ache in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it no longer consumed him entirely. "I'm going to try," he said, his voice raspy, the words catching in his throat. "Try to get my GED. Try to get a job. Try to stay clean." The simplicity of his words belied the monumental effort they represented. The "try" hung in the air, a fragile promise whispered against the backdrop of his daunting reality. He knew the odds were stacked against him. The pull of the streets, the familiar comfort of addiction, was a siren song he'd always struggled to resist. But Marco's death had shattered that comfort, exposing its lethal undercurrent. He didn't want to end up like his brother, a statistic, a casualty of a broken system. He wanted to fight, to struggle, to claw his way out of the darkness that had enveloped his family for generations. Javier nodded, a grim understanding flickering in his eyes. He'd already begun making plans, albeit tentative ones. His older sister, though struggling with her own demons, had offered him a place to stay, a lifeline in the turbulent sea of his life. He knew it wasn't a guarantee of a smooth transition, that her life was precarious, her own recovery fragile. But it was a start, a small foothold on the slippery slope back to society. He had enrolled in a vocational training program, hoping to learn a trade, something concrete, something that could offer him stability and a sense of purpose. The thought of going back to the cycle of petty crimes that had landed him here felt both repulsive and familiar. He shuddered at the prospect. The fear of relapse and the allure of easy money, though still ever present, was slowly but surely being outweighed by a budding desire for a different life. Luis, ever the observer, spoke less, but his actions spoke volumes. His sketchbook, once filled with dark, brooding landscapes, now held tentative sketches of vibrant flowers, bold strokes of color pushing back against the lingering shadows of his grief. He'd been accepted into an art program at a community college, a fragile step towards a future he'd never dared to dream of. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The financial burden would be immense, the academic challenges significant. But the prospect of creating, of expressing himself through his art, felt like a lifeline, a pathway to a brighter future. He found a quiet strength in his determination, a newfound confidence he never knew he had. The art became his sanctuary, a place of healing and growth. He understood that creating beautiful things was an act of defiance, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The other boys, each grappling with their own demons and uncertainties, echoed the same sentiments, albeit with varying degrees of conviction. Some spoke of reuniting with family members, others of finding employment, still others of enrolling in educational programs or seeking therapy. The common thread running through their aspirations was a shared determination to create a different future, to break free from the cycles of violence, addiction, and despair that had defined their pasts. Their commitment was fragile, tentative, but undeniably present. It was a testament to their resilience, their capacity for hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Their discussions weren't devoid of doubt and fear. They acknowledged the immense challenges ahead, the stigma of their past, the difficulty of finding employment with a criminal record, the ever-present temptation of old habits. They talked about the potential for relapse, the possibility of failure. But instead of succumbing to despair, they faced these fears head-on, acknowledging them as part of the process, not as insurmountable obstacles. They supported each other, offering words of encouragement, sharing their anxieties, reminding each other of their shared goals, their collective commitment to building a better life. The loss of Marco served as a stark reminder of the stakes involved, fueling their determination to succeed where he had failed. Ms. Rodriguez listened patiently, offering guidance and encouragement, but never imposing her own solutions. She understood that their journeys were intensely personal, that their paths to redemption would be unique and unpredictable. Her role was to facilitate their growth, to provide them with the tools and resources they needed to navigate the complexities of their lives. She knew that their success wasn't guaranteed, that setbacks were inevitable. But she also knew that they possessed a strength, a resilience she had rarely witnessed in young men facing similar circumstances. The shared experience of grief, the forging of a powerful bond, had become a catalyst for change. Leaving juvenile hall wasn't merely about stepping out of its confines, it was about stepping into an uncertain future, a future fraught with challenges but also brimming with potential. The boys were acutely aware that their pasts would always be a part of them, but their present was a testament to their refusal to be defined by it. Their collective determination to transcend their past formed a new chapter in their lives. A journey filled with uncertainties and obstacles, but ultimately one filled with a courageous hope for the future. The journey towards redemption wasn't a linear path, it was a winding road, filled with unexpected turns and detours. But as they stepped out of the gates of juvenile hall, they walked with a newfound purpose, their spirits buoyed by a shared vision of a better future, their steps supported by a bond forged in the crucible of grief and loss. The outside world wasn't a utopia, the challenges they faced were numerous. Finding stable housing was a constant struggle, the stigma of a juvenile record followed them like a shadow. Employment prospects were limited, the temptation of easy money and old habits constantly gnawed at their resolve. Yet, despite these obstacles, they persevered. They leaned on each other for support, celebrating small victories and offering solace during setbacks. They attended support groups, stayed in contact with Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Evans, and actively sought help when needed. Miguel found employment as a construction worker, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the turmoil within. The job was grueling, the pay low, but it offered him a sense of purpose, a tangible connection to something real. Javier's vocational training paid off. He secured an apprenticeship as an electrician, his hands finding purpose in the precise work, a welcome respite from the chaos of his past. Luis's art became his solace and his livelihood, his paintings gaining recognition in the local community, slowly building a reputation for his unique style. He found a sense of fulfillment in creating, expressing his emotions through art, transforming his pain into something beautiful. Their success stories weren't without their stumbles. There were moments of relapse, periods of doubt, times when the weight of their past threatened to overwhelm them. But they learned to navigate these moments together, offering each other support, understanding, and forgiveness. They recognized that setbacks were a part of the process, not a sign of failure. Their commitment to each other remained strong, their bond an anchor in the storm. The narrative of their lives wasn't a fairy tale, it was a gritty realism, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a story of ongoing struggles and hard-won victories, a tale of redemption earned through perseverance, dedication, and unwavering support. The path to a better future was never easy, it was a continuous battle against adversity, but their shared journey, their mutual support, and their relentless hope provided a steady guiding light through the darkest of times. Their stories underscored the power of collective resilience, the triumph of hope over despair, and the transformative potential of human connection in overcoming the most challenging of circumstances. Their future remained unwritten, but it was a future they were determined to shape, together. Chapter 6. Release and Uncertain Futures. The morning of their release dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the uncertain mood inside the juvenile hall. The air crackled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. For 10 months, these walls had been their world, a brutal, unforgiving reality where survival was a daily battle. Now, the gates stood before them, promising freedom, but also hinting at the tempestuous journey that lay ahead. The familiar routine of head counts, breakfast trays, and the echoing clang of metal doors felt strangely absent, replaced by an unnerving quiet, a void filled only by the nervous energy of the boys. Miguel, usually the most outwardly confident, paced restlessly, his hands clenched into fists. The meticulously planned future he'd outlined in therapy felt flimsy, a house of cards threatened by the slightest gust of wind. The GED classes he'd diligently attended, the job application he'd submitted, all of it felt suddenly insignificant against the vast, intimidating landscape of the real world. He'd imagined freedom as a triumphant moment, a clean break from the past, but the reality felt more like a plunge into a cold, unforgiving sea. Javier, ever practical, seemed outwardly calmer. He had his sister's promise of a place to stay, a small victory in itself. The vocational training program had equipped him with skills, but the uncertainty of finding a job, the fear of disappointing his sister, gnawed at him silently. He ran a hand through his short hair, the gesture betraying the anxiety masked by his stoic expression. The familiar comfort of the juvenile hall, as bleak as it had been, was now replaced by a chilling void, a stark awareness of his utter vulnerability. Luis, his sketchbook clutched in his hand, seemed lost in his own world. The vibrant colors of his drawings stood in sharp contrast to the drabness of his surroundings. The acceptance into the community college art program was a beacon of hope, but the financial burden, the academic rigors, felt like insurmountable obstacles. He knew his talent was a gift, but it felt like a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities waiting outside. He had grown accustomed to the structure of juvenile hall, the routine of life in this controlled environment. Now the absence of this felt both liberating and terrifying. The others mirrored this blend of hope and fear, their individual anxieties forming a collective current of apprehension. The camaraderie forged in the crucible of their shared experiences offered a measure of comfort, a sense of collective strength. But the reality of facing the world alone, armed only with the fragile hope nurtured within the confines of the juvenile hall, was a daunting prospect. The release process itself was a stark contrast to their incarceration. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no fanfare, just a series of routine procedures, paperwork, fingerprinting, cursory medical checks. The efficiency felt cold, impersonal, devoid of the human touch that Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Evans had provided. The swiftness of it all felt jarring. It was as if they were being unceremoniously ejected, spat out into a world utterly unprepared to receive them. Stepping out of the gates was like stepping into another dimension. The air, once thick with the cloying scent of disinfectant and despair, was now alive with the cacophony of city sounds. Honking cars, the distant wail of sirens, the chatter of passers-by. The sheer sensory overload was dizzying. The mundane aspects of this, normal, life, cars, bustling streets, the noise of the city, seemed alien and bewildering. The simple act of navigating a street, of crossing an intersection, felt like a monumental task. It wasn't simply the freedom from confinement, it was the utter disorientation of a world they no longer understood. The world outside was a stark contrast to the controlled environment of juvenile hall. The overwhelming sensory input, the sheer volume of choices, the lack of structure, it was all profoundly disorienting. The boys found themselves adrift in a sea of possibilities, yet simultaneously constrained by the limitations imposed by their pasts. Finding stable housing proved to be the first significant challenge. Most landlords were reluctant to rent to young men with juvenile records, forcing them to rely on the kindness of family or friends, a kindness that was not always readily available. Those who had family support found their lives teetering on the edge of stability, relying on the goodwill and often limited resources of family members, many of whom were struggling with their own issues. Miguel's construction job, while physically demanding and poorly paid, offered him a sense of routine and purpose. The hard labor was a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil, a way to channel his nervous energy into something tangible. However, the irregular hours and low pay made it difficult to save money, to build a stable foundation for his future. The constant threat of layoffs also weighed on him, a lingering reminder of his precarious situation. Javier's apprenticeship was a beacon of hope, but even with his newly acquired skills, the work was challenging, the hours long, and the pay modest. The constant pressure to perform, to prove himself worthy of the opportunity, created significant stress. Moreover, the stigma associated with his past continued to haunt him, casting a long shadow over his efforts. Luis, despite his artistic success, faced immense financial hurdles. The cost of art supplies, the expenses related to exhibiting his work, the pressure to generate income from his art, all added layers of difficulty to his journey. He found solace in his work, but the constant struggle to find a balance between artistic expression and financial stability continued to challenge him. The shared experiences, the bond forged within the walls of the juvenile hall, proved to be an invaluable lifeline. They supported each other through the struggles, offering words of encouragement and practical help. They held each other accountable, reminding one another of their goals, helping navigate the emotional storms that arose. The mutual support system provided a safety net, a buffer against the harsh realities of their lives. But even with their collective resilience, setbacks were inevitable. The allure of old habits, the temptations of quick money, the weight of their pasts, all loomed over them, threatening to derail their progress. There were moments of despair, times when the weight of their struggles threatened to overwhelm them. Yet, they persevered, their bond strengthened by their shared experiences, their commitment to each other unwavering. Their release day wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a beginning, a new chapter in a story still being written. It was a testament to their resilience, their determination to overcome the odds, to build a future that transcended their past. The path remained challenging, fraught with uncertainty, but they walked it together, their steps supported by the strength of their collective hope, the enduring power of their bond. Their journey toward redemption was ongoing, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The future remained uncertain, but they faced it together, united in their shared vision of a better tomorrow. The world outside was harsh, unforgiving, but they were ready, prepared to face it, together, determined to shape their destinies. The first few weeks were a blur of disorientation. The constant noise of the city, a stark contrast to the muted sounds of Juvenile Hall, was initially overwhelming. The smells, the exhaust fumes, the greasy aroma of street food, the sharp tang of rain on hot pavement, assaulted their senses, a bombardment of stimuli they weren't prepared for. Even the simplest tasks, crossing a street, ordering food, using public transport, felt daunting, requiring a level of navigation and social interaction they'd largely forgotten. Their carefully constructed routines within the hall, however imperfect, had given them a sense of structure, a predictable rhythm to their days. Now, the freedom they'd craved felt more like a dizzying, unpredictable whirlwind. Finding stable housing proved to be the first major hurdle. Miguel, with his limited savings and a juvenile record, faced a relentless string of rejections from landlords. He spent weeks searching, relying on the kindness of a distant uncle who reluctantly agreed to let him stay in a cramped basement room, an arrangement fraught with tension and unspoken expectations. Javier, who had secured the support of his older sister, Isabel, fared slightly better, but their small apartment was already overcrowded, the addition of Javier straining the family's already stretched resources. Luis, with his artistic leanings and lack of practical job skills, struggled the most. He found himself couch surfing, drifting from one temporary arrangement to another, his sketchbook his only constant companion. The search for employment mirrored the housing struggle. Miguel secured a physically demanding construction job through a friend of his uncle, backbreaking work that paid minimum wage, but offered a semblance of structure and purpose. He woke before dawn, his body aching by the end of each day, but the exhaustion was preferable to the gnawing anxiety of unemployment. The grueling nature of the work, however, left little time for anything else, severely restricting his ability to focus on his GED studies and his plans for attending college. Javier's vocational training in carpentry proved marginally more fruitful. He found an apprenticeship with a small contractor, a demanding but promising opportunity. However, the work was far from steady, and the constant pressure to prove himself, to shake off the stigma of his past, took its toll. He found himself replaying past mistakes in his mind, his anxiety flaring whenever he interacted with his supervisor. The fear of letting his sister down added another layer to his already considerable stress. Luis's situation was the most precarious. His artistic talent, though undeniable, did not translate into immediate financial security. He relied on odd jobs, taking commissions for portraits and illustrations, but the income was erratic and insufficient to cover his basic needs. The struggle to balance his creative aspirations with the need to survive created a constant internal conflict, undermining his artistic process and deepening his sense of despair. He started to find solace in isolated sketching sessions in forgotten corners of the city, the anonymity offering a refuge from his struggles. The city itself became a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The once exciting urban environment now felt threatening, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The shadows seemed darker, the crowds more menacing. The places they frequented, abandoned buildings, dimly lit alleyways, deserted parks, became the backdrop of their struggles, reflecting the bleakness of their situation. The camaraderie that had sustained them within the juvenile hall remained a lifeline. They met regularly, sharing their experiences, offering mutual support. Miguel's exhaustion was counterbalanced by Javier's practicality and Luis's artistic spirit, a patchwork of skills and emotional resilience helping them navigate their shared challenges. Their weekly meetings weren't therapy sessions, but vital survival strategies. They shared tips on finding affordable food, resources for job hunting, and coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and setbacks. But even their shared resilience couldn't completely overcome the obstacles they faced. The constant struggle for stability, the daily grind of survival, tested their bond. There were moments of friction, arguments born out of frustration and exhaustion. The temptations of their past, the allure of quick money, the comfort of old habits, the pressure to fit in with peer groups who didn't share their experiences, were ever-present threats. One evening, Miguel found himself caught in a heated argument with his uncle. A minor disagreement escalated into a shouting match, ending with Miguel leaving the house in a fit of rage, seeking solace in the familiar refuge of the streets. The night unfolded into a chaotic spiral, ending with him losing his construction job due to an absence from work. He had briefly relapsed into old habits, a fleeting moment of reckless abandon, resulting in consequences that mirrored his past. He found himself reeling, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Javier, grappling with the pressure of his apprenticeship, resorted to unhealthy coping mechanisms. The stress manifested as sleepless nights and fits of anger, creating friction with his sister and adding to the family's tension. He found himself feeling suffocated and trapped by the expectations and challenges of his new environment. The pressure to succeed, to live up to the responsibility he'd taken on, was overwhelming. He felt himself slipping back into self-destructive patterns, threatening to unravel the fragile progress he had made. Luis's artistic dreams were constantly overshadowed by his financial struggles. The weight of debt, the continuous rejection of his artwork, combined with a lack of confidence from numerous rejections, led to a period of artistic stagnation. His once vibrant colors paled, his once dynamic brush strokes losing their power. He struggled with depression and a lack of inspiration, losing his vision for his artistic future. The harsh realities of survival had threatened to snuff out his artistic flame. Their shared experiences, though fraught with challenges, served as both a source of pain and a profound connection. It was in those moments of vulnerability, of shared despair, that their bond deepened. They helped each other navigate the labyrinthine pathways of social services, offering practical assistance with navigating bureaucracy. They pushed each other to seek out resources, reminding one another of their potential. They learned to lean on each other for strength, finding solace in the recognition of their shared journey, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their journey toward reintegration was far from over, their futures uncertain, but they faced it together, their steps faltering but steady. The scars of their pasts were indelible, but they found strength in their shared experiences, the knowledge that they were not alone in their fight for a brighter future. The road ahead remained daunting, the challenges overwhelming at times, but they continued to walk it together, supporting each other, determined to build a future that transcended their past. The city, once a symbol of their vulnerability, now became the canvas upon which they were painstakingly building their lives, one day at a time. The fluorescent lights of the community center hummed, a stark counterpoint to the hushed murmurs of the group gathered in the circle of worn plastic chairs. It was a Tuesday night, the night of their weekly support group, a fragile oasis in the harsh desert of their post-Juvie lives. Miguel, his face etched with the weariness of a man twice his age, sat hunched in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The raw edges of his recent relapse still gnawed at him, a constant, throbbing reminder of his fragility. The construction job was gone, lost to a drunken night and a regrettable lapse in judgment. The shame, thick and suffocating, clung to him like a second skin. Javier, his usually sharp features softened by exhaustion, fidgeted with a loose thread on his worn jeans. The apprenticeship, once a beacon of hope, had become a source of immense pressure. He'd snapped at his sister, a familiar pattern of self-destruction resurfacing. The guilt was a heavy weight on his chest, a constant, agonizing reminder of his precarious balance. He'd considered walking away, disappearing, but the thought of letting his sister down, of abandoning the progress he'd made, kept him tethered to reality. Luis, his artistic spirit muted by months of struggle, sat silently, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The vibrant energy that once pulsed through his artwork had dimmed, replaced by a dull ache of despair. The constant rejections, the relentless pressure to produce commercially viable art while battling crippling self-doubt, had chipped away at his confidence. He'd stopped painting, his sketchbook gathering dust, a stark symbol of his creative paralysis. The silence that surrounded him felt comforting in its familiarity, a safe space from the crushing weight of expectation. The facilitator, a woman named Ms. Evans, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, spoke softly, her voice a soothing balm in the room's tense atmosphere. "It's okay to falter, to stumble," she said, her words carrying the weight of experience and empathy. "The path to recovery isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when you feel like giving up. But what matters is that you keep coming back, that you keep fighting." Miguel finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "I messed up," he confessed, his eyes avoiding the others. "Lost my job, blew it all. Felt like I was back in Juvie, only this time, there's no walls to keep me contained, just myself and my mistakes." A silence fell over the group, a heavy blanket of understanding. There was no judgment, only empathy. Javier nodded slowly. "I'm struggling, too. The pressure's overwhelming. I feel like I'm suffocating, that I can't breathe." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice tight with emotion. "I almost walked away, went back to the streets, but something stopped me. The thought of letting Isabel down. It kept me here." Luis, breaking his silence, spoke in a barely audible whisper. "The art. It's gone. I can't paint anymore. It's all dark, empty." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Miss Evans listened patiently, offering nods of encouragement, her presence a quiet affirmation of their struggles. She gently guided them toward sharing coping mechanisms, strategies for dealing with triggers, and the importance of self-compassion. They spoke of the cravings, the temptations, the subtle insidious ways that their pasts continued to haunt them. They shared their fears, their insecurities, their vulnerabilities, creating a space where honesty and raw emotion were not only accepted but encouraged. The conversation drifted to the support systems they built, the individuals who had become anchors in their lives. Miguel spoke of the uneasy truce he'd established with his uncle, acknowledging the limits of their strained relationship while acknowledging his uncle's flawed but unwavering support. Javier described his sister Isabel as his unwavering beacon of hope, her unwavering love and support the foundation of his recovery. Luis talked about finding solace in a small group of fellow artists, their shared struggles forging an unbreakable bond. The discussion turned to the practical challenges of navigating the system, the daunting task of securing stable housing, employment, and access to essential services. They discussed the systemic barriers they faced, the challenges of overcoming the stigma associated with their pasts, the constant fight for opportunity and recognition. The stories were often grim, filled with setbacks and disappointments, yet the collective sharing somehow managed to lighten the load, transforming the individual weight of burden into a shared collective experience. The realization that they weren't alone in their struggles was a powerful force of resilience, a reminder of their shared strength. The meeting ended with a shared sense of resilience and a renewed commitment to their individual paths of recovery. There was a recognition of their individual battles, the ongoing challenges that lay ahead, but there was also a profound understanding of the strength they could find in their shared journey, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. As they filed out of the community center into the chilly night air, a quiet strength lingered in the air, a silent testament to the unwavering human capacity to fight, to heal, to rise again. The days that followed were still punctuated by struggles. Miguel found himself wrestling with the demons of addiction, the memories of his relapse a haunting presence. He fought against the temptation to numb the pain with substances but found support in the structure of the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings he had started attending, his sponsor serving as a crucial lifeline during his darkest moments. Javier battled the pressures of his apprenticeship, but this time, he found himself opening up to his sister about his fears, his vulnerability leading to an outpouring of love and understanding. Their conversations became a vital part of his healing process. Luis, after weeks of artistic paralysis, finally picked up his brush. He began slowly, tentatively, but soon his creativity rekindled, his canvases once again exploding with color. He found a small gallery willing to showcase his work, a small victory but significant in its demonstration of his growth. The gallery did not bring wealth, but it brought recognition, a validation of his abilities that had been sorely lacking during his time of struggle. The city, once a hostile backdrop to their struggles, now became a canvas on which they painted their futures. The challenges remained, the uncertainties persisted, but their shared experiences, their unwavering support for one another, fueled their resilience. Their futures were still uncertain, their paths fraught with obstacles, but they were facing them together, a collective force against the tide of adversity. They were writing a new chapter, one filled with pain and struggle, yes, but also one teeming with the quiet strength of hope, resilience, and an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of adversity. The journey towards full recovery would be long, but they were walking it together, hand in hand, determined to build lives that transcended their past. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the worn wooden table in Miguel's uncle's cramped apartment. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and something faintly sweet, the lingering aroma of Miguel's uncle's nightly ritual, a cheap bottle of rum, a silent companion in his own solitary struggle. Miguel, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, watched his uncle, a man hardened by years of disappointment and regret, carefully fold a worn newspaper. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was a familiar language, a shared understanding of unspoken burdens. "Got a job interview tomorrow," Miguel announced, his voice low, almost hesitant. The admission felt vulnerable, a crack in the carefully constructed wall of his stoicism. He'd avoided discussing it with his uncle, fearing another lecture, another reminder of his past failures. He'd cleaned himself up, attended every meeting, found a halfway house that offered a semblance of stability, but the fear of falling short, of letting everyone down, was a constant, gnawing presence. His uncle grunted, a noncommittal sound that could mean anything or nothing. He finally looked up. His eyes that had seen too much, known too much, holding a flicker of something that might have been pride. "Construction?" he asked, his voice rough, weathered like the bark of an old oak tree. Miguel nodded. "Landscaping, actually. Small firm, but it's a start." He took a deep breath, the air catching in his throat. The interview was more than just an interview. It was a step towards redemption, a chance to prove to himself, to his uncle, and to everyone who doubted him that he was capable of more than his past mistakes. His uncle didn't offer words of encouragement, not in the traditional sense. He simply nodded again, his silence a testament to his understanding of the unspoken weight of Miguel's aspirations. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was a silent acknowledgement of the shared history, the common ground forged in the fires of their shared struggles. It was a form of support, unspoken yet profoundly felt. Javier, meanwhile, found himself leaning on his sister, Isabel, more than ever before. The apprenticeship, initially a source of stress, had transformed into a source of unexpected strength. He'd confided in Isabel about his anxieties, his fear of failure, the persistent shadow of his past mistakes. Her unwavering support, her unconditional love, had become a lifeline, a source of strength that anchored him during turbulent times. She listened patiently, her empathy a constant source of reassurance. They talked late into the night, their conversations a mixture of shared laughter and quiet confessions, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the bonds of family could provide a sanctuary. The bond between siblings, forged in a crucible of shared hardship, proved to be stronger than any other support system. Isabel understood his struggles, not intellectually, but viscerally. She had witnessed his battles firsthand, shared his pain, and experienced the crushing weight of their shared circumstances. Her understanding wasn't based on theory, it was rooted in lived experience, a profound connection that transcended words. Luis's path was different, a solitary journey punctuated by moments of shared inspiration. He found solace in a small, close-knit community of artists, a refuge where he could share his vulnerabilities without judgment. The shared struggles, the mutual understanding, formed a powerful support system, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his battles with self-doubt and creative paralysis. They critiqued each other's work, offered encouragement, and celebrated each other's small victories, a shared journey towards artistic redemption. The small gallery where Luis showcased his work became a hub of unexpected connection. He discovered a community beyond his immediate group of friends, a wider network of support that stretched into the larger artistic world. The validation he received, the recognition of his talent, instilled a sense of purpose, a belief in his abilities that had been sorely lacking during his darkest days. The success was not financial, it was the recognition of his talent, the confirmation that his voice mattered. Their weekly support group meetings, led by Ms. Evans, continued to be a vital part of their recovery. The shared stories, the raw honesty, the collective understanding, created a space where vulnerability was strength. They talked about their successes and failures, their hopes and fears, their ongoing battles with addiction, depression, and the lingering trauma of their past. The meetings were not just therapy sessions, they were rituals of resilience, affirmations of their shared commitment to recovery. One evening, Miguel shared his success at the landscaping job. The modest victory sparked a wave of excitement and support. Javier, inspired by Miguel's courage, opened up about a promotion at his apprenticeship, a testament to his perseverance. Luis proudly shared a review of his exhibition, a confirmation of his blossoming artistic talent. The shared celebration, the collective sense of accomplishment, reinforced their resilience and strengthened their resolve to continue their journey towards recovery. The path wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, relapses, moments of despair. But the support systems they'd built, the bonds of friendship and family, proved invaluable during their darkest moments. They leaned on each other, offering encouragement, sharing coping mechanisms, celebrating small victories, and weathering the storms together. They understood that recovery wasn't a linear path but a continuous process of growth, of resilience, of finding strength in their shared vulnerabilities. Their uncertain futures became a shared journey, a testament to the power of human connection, the enduring capacity of hope in the face of adversity, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. Their individual stories intertwine, creating a powerful narrative of resilience, recovery, and the enduring possibility of redemption. The city lights, once a symbol of their struggles, now reflected the hope that flickered in their hearts, a silent testament to the transformative power of community and the shared journey towards a brighter future. The bus rumbled through the city, a metal beast swallowing the boys and spitting them out into the chaotic sprawl of urban life. For Miguel, the ride felt surreal. The cramped confines of Juvie, the constant surveillance, the metallic tang of fear, all of it felt like a distant, bad dream. Now, the city air, thick with exhaust fumes and the scent of 1,000 different lives, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. His landscaping job awaited him, a small victory in a war that had only just begun. The tiny apartment he shared with his uncle still held the weight of his past, but it felt lighter somehow, the shadows less oppressive. He had a routine, a purpose, a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to imagine only months ago. Yet the uncertainty still gnawed at him, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. Could he truly escape the gravitational pull of his past? Javier, meanwhile, was immersed in the fast-paced world of construction. His apprenticeship had turned into a full-time job, the long hours demanding but strangely rewarding. The physical exertion, the sense of purpose, helped to channel the restless energy that had once led him down a dark path. He was learning a trade, building something tangible, something solid. But the nights were often lonely. Isabel's support was unwavering, but he found himself fighting old demons, battling the insidious whispers of doubt that threatened to derail him. He'd seen too much violence, known too much loss. Could he truly reconcile with his past, or would it forever haunt him, a shadow clinging to his heels? Luis's path took him to the vibrant pulse of the city's art scene. His small gallery show had been more successful than he ever dared hope, attracting the attention of a local art critic and leading to a small but prestigious commission. The validation felt like a lifeline. He found himself surrounded by a community of fellow artists, their struggles and triumphs mirroring his own. The shared creative energy, the intense focus on their craft, was a balm to his soul. But the precarious nature of his new life weighed heavily on him. The artistic world was fickle, the success tenuous, the risk of failure ever present. The uncertainty of funding, of consistent commissions, gnawed at him, threatening to pull him back into the darkness he had so recently escaped. The weekly support group meetings continued to be a lifeline for all of them. They were no longer just a group of boys caught in the juvenile justice system, they were men forging their own paths, their own identities. They celebrated small victories, commiserated over setbacks, and provided unwavering support for each other. The shared experiences, the raw honesty, formed an unbreakable bond, a powerful antidote to the isolation and despair that had threatened to consume them. Yet, the shadow of their pasts still loomed large. The meetings often descended into heated debates about trust, betrayal, and the seemingly insurmountable barriers placed before them by a system that had failed them. One evening, Miguel shared a harrowing near-miss. A chance encounter with a former gang member from his past, an almost confrontation that left him shaken and unsure. He was haunted by the memory, feeling the phantom weight of a life he'd barely escaped. Javier revealed the pressures of his construction job, the relentless physical demands, the ever-present risk of injury. He felt the strain of providing for his family, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Luis spoke about the constant struggle for recognition, the relentless self-doubt that threatened to undermine his artistic aspirations. Ms. Evans, their tireless counselor, listened patiently, her empathy a calming force amidst the tempestuous emotions. She reminded them of their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to their futures. She highlighted their accomplishments, their growth, the incredible progress they had made. But she also acknowledged the inherent difficulties, the pervasive challenges that society placed before them. She stressed the importance of self-care, the need to create healthy support systems, the necessity of acknowledging setbacks as part of the process, not as failures. The city lights twinkled outside the window, a mesmerizing dance of colors and shadows. Inside the room, The atmosphere was tense, filled with a shared vulnerability, a raw honesty that bound them together. They weren't simply sharing their struggles, they were forging a collective identity, a shared narrative of resilience and hope. The journey was far from over, the path ahead still uncertain. But they had each other, a support system stronger than any wall, any barrier. Months passed. Miguel's landscaping career flourished. He secured a bigger contract, his skills sharpening, his confidence growing. He even started saving money, dreaming of a future beyond his uncle's cramped apartment. Javier's construction work led to a promotion and a small raise, a tangible reward for his hard work and perseverance. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a pride in his abilities that had been long dormant. Luis's art gained wider recognition, his work featured in a prominent art fair. The positive feedback, the growing appreciation of his talent, instilled a confidence he hadn't felt before. But the challenges persisted. Miguel faced moments of doubt, the fear of falling back into old habits, the ever-present shadow of his past. Javier wrestled with the physical demands of his job, the strain on his body, the constant fear of injury. Luis battled the insecurity inherent in the art world, the pressure to continually create, to constantly prove his worth. The support group remained a constant in their lives, a source of strength and resilience. They gathered every week, their stories evolving, their challenges shifting, but their bonds remaining steadfast. The group had become a family, a chosen kinship forged in the crucible of adversity. They learned from each other, supported each other, celebrating victories, weathering storms, together. The future remained uncertain, a path veiled in mist. But their hopes, once fragile sparks, now burned with a steady, resolute flame. They had faced the depths of despair, tasted the bitterness of failure, and emerged, scarred but stronger, into the light. Their stories were a testament to the indomitable human spirit, the enduring power of hope, and the transformative potential of community and unwavering support. The city lights still shone, but now they reflected not just the uncertainty of their futures, but also the unwavering resilience of their spirits, their collective determination to build a better tomorrow, one brick, one brushstroke, one sunrise at a time. Their journey was far from over, but they faced the uncertainty not with fear, but with a newfound courage, a shared strength forged in the fires of their past. Back matter. First and foremost, I extend my deepest gratitude to the young men who shared their stories with me. Their courage, resilience, and willingness to trust me with their experiences are the foundation of this book. Their voices, though fictionalized, are the heart of this narrative. I am eternally grateful for their bravery and the invaluable lessons they taught me. To the staff at the Juvenile Detention Center who graciously allowed me access and shared their insights, I express my sincere appreciation. Their dedication and unwavering commitment to these young individuals is inspiring. Their perspectives, though not directly quoted, helped shape my understanding and informed my writing. My thanks also go to my editor, Lisa Gates, whose insightful feedback and guidance shaped the manuscript into its final form. Her patience and expertise were invaluable throughout the writing process. I also thank my agent, Zach Thomas, for unwavering support and belief in this project. Finally, I dedicate this book to my family and friends, whose love and understanding sustained me through the challenges of this writing journey. Their unwavering support provided the crucial space and encouragement I needed to bring this story to life. This appendix includes relevant statistical data on juvenile incarceration rates in California in the United States of America from 2024 to 2025. This information is intended to provide a broader context to the narrative and highlight the systemic issues facing at-risk youth. Juvie, slang term for Juvenile Detention Center. Parole, the release of a prisoner temporarily or permanently before the completion of a sentence, on the promise of good behavior. Probation, a period of supervision imposed by a court instead of imprisonment. Recidivism, the tendency of a convicted criminal to re-offend. Disposition, the final decision of a juvenile court regarding a youth offender, including placement, services, and conditions. The system is meant to rehabilitate and re-establish people back into society with tools to be successful upon getting released from custody. But sadly that's not how our system is. What is happening in juvenile halls, jails, and prisons hardly show rehabilitation. The system holds young people back, like for instance upon release they're labeled a criminal and most likely not able to get a job to support themselves. More than likely they was not trained in any type of trade schooling or any form of education while incarcerated. Speaking from experience, most people who get released from custody find challenges navigating a straight path because they have no resources and nobody there to help them, so most return back to crime. Secondly, most people need to get out of their environments of where they live at, but how our system works: if they catch a crime in a county they will be paroled back out to that county. Most people is looking for a way out but cannot get one, so they're forced to remain in their neighborhoods and environments that are so detrimental to them. What's even worse is if they are not from that area where they caught their case at when they were arrested, immediately upon release they are released to that county on probation or parole. It's hard to get a transfer to a different city. It's possible but chances are slim. For one, that county that they're trying to switch to has to accept them, but mostly the county they paroled in does not want to give up the revenue that will be receiving off that individual. Michael A. Neal is a young adult author whose work focuses on gritty realism and crime fiction. Inspired by personal experiences, his writing explores the complexities of the human condition, particularly as it intersects with social injustice and the challenges faced by at-risk youth. Michael A. Neal holds a degree in Associate's Entrepreneurship degree from Heald College and has spent 3 years conducting extensive research on juvenile justice systems and the experiences of incarcerated youth. His work strives to shed light on often overlooked realities and promote understanding and empathy.